The men came before dawn. Ethan Walker heard them from inside the house. Boots crunching hard across frozen ground, lanterns swinging, voices carrying the kind of certainty that only comes when a group of men have already decided what they're going to do before they arrive. He opened the front door before they could knock. Harold Marsh stood at the front of the group. 6 other men stood behind him, breath clouding in the dark air, faces tight with something between disgust and satisfaction. Harold was the kind of man who wore his respectability like armor. Deacon of the church, owner of the largest dry goods store in Calverton, husband to a woman who had never once in her life been cold or hungry or afraid. "Ethan," Harold said. Not a greeting, a verdict. "Harold!" Ethan leaned one shoulder against the doorframe. "It's 4 in the morning. We know what time it is." Harold's eyes moved past Ethan into the house. "We want her gone. Tonight." Behind Ethan, from somewhere deeper in the house, came the soft sound of a baby stirring in sleep. If you ever found 2 strangers dying in your barn on the worst night of the year, and you had to choose between your reputation and their lives, what would you do? What would it cost you? And what would it make you? What? Before that night, before Harold Marsh and his lanterns and his righteous anger, there was just the storm. It came in from the northwest the way the worst ones always did, without much warning and without mercy. Ethan had spent the afternoon hauling firewood and checking the water troughs, watching the sky turn from gray to the specific shade of yellow-white that meant serious cold was coming. He had lived on this land for 31 years. He knew that color. By evening, the temperature had dropped far enough that the inside of his nostrils stung with every breath he took, and the wind had picked up enough to rattle the shutters he'd meant to fix since October. He built the fire up high, ate a plate of beans he'd warmed on the stove, and sat in the chair by the window, the way he'd sat most evenings for the past decade, alone, quiet, the kind of quiet that had long since stopped feeling peaceful and started feeling like punishment. He was not a man who talked about loneliness. He barely let himself think the word. But it lived in the house with him the way cold lives in old wood, settled deep in the grain, impossible to fully drive out. He'd been married once. Clara. They had a son named Thomas, who had his mother's dark eyes and Ethan's stubborn jaw, and they had built something real together on this land, the kind of life that feels ordinary while you're living it and unbearable to remember once it's gone. A fever came through the valley in the summer of 1887. It took Thomas first, and then Clara 11 days later, and it left Ethan standing in a house that still smelled like them, surrounded by their things, with nothing to do but keep breathing. He kept breathing. He kept working. He kept the ranch running because the ranch was the only thing that still needed him. He did not replace what he'd lost. He stopped expecting anything from the future at all. That was the man sitting by the window when he heard the sound from the barn. At first he thought it was an animal, one of the horses spooked by the wind, maybe, or a coyote that had gotten in through the gap in the south wall he'd also meant to fix and hadn't. He almost didn't go out. The cold had turned brutal in the last hour, and the barn was 50 yards from the house, and he was tired in the particular bone-deep way that comes not from hard work, but from years of living without much reason to move quickly. But the sound came again. It wasn't an animal. He pulled on his coat, his hat, his gloves. He lit the lantern by the door. He stepped outside and the cold hit him like something with weight behind it, pressing against his face and chest, finding every gap in his clothing immediately and without apology. He crossed the yard with his head down and his eyes half shut against the wind. He pulled the barn door open. The lantern light spilled across the hay, and in the far corner, half buried in loose straw, he saw her. She was young. Younger than he'd expected from the sound, which had been almost animal in its desperation. She couldn't have been more than 22, 23. She was wearing a coat that wasn't near heavy enough for this weather, and her lips had gone the color of old slate, and she was shaking so hard he could see it from 10 feet away. She had her arms wrapped around something against her chest, curled around it with the particular fierce tightness of someone protecting the only thing they have left. The baby was small, too small, he thought, and too quiet. The woman looked up at him when he came close, and what he saw in her face was not relief, not yet. It was the look of someone who has been afraid for so long that fear has become the only thing that feels normal, who sees a large man with a lantern coming toward her in the dark and cannot yet process that he might not be a threat. "Don't," she said. Her voice was barely there. Please don't. Ethan stopped. He crouched down so he was at her level rather than standing over her, because some instinct told him that the height was making things worse. I'm not going to hurt you, he said. She stared at him. The baby made a sound, thin, reedy, worrying. The baby, Ethan said. Is it sick? She's cold. The woman's jaw was shaking so hard the words came out jagged. She needs to be warm. She stopped, pressed her lips together. I didn't know where else to go. Ethan looked at them both for a long moment. He looked at the woman's coat, at the infant pressed against her chest, at the hay they'd been lying in. He looked at the barn door behind him, swinging in the wind, and beyond it the dark yard and the lit windows of his empty house. He stood up. Come inside, he said. She didn't move. I have a fire, he said, and food, and I'm not going to hurt either of you. He paused, because something in him recognized that words alone weren't going to be enough, not for someone who'd arrived in a stranger's barn, half frozen, with a sick baby. My name is Ethan Walker. I've lived on this land my whole life. I'm alone here, and I mean you no harm. He extended his hand. Come inside. She looked at his hand. Then, slowly, she reached up and took it. Her name was Lydia Carter, and she told him most of it while he was getting the fire built back up and heating water on the stove and pulling blankets from the chest in the hallway where Clara had kept them. Good wool blankets that still smelled faintly of cedar and had not been used in years. She told it the way people tell things when they're still in shock, in fragments, not in order, circling back and correcting herself, leaving gaps she either couldn't fill or wasn't ready to fill yet. She'd come from east of the valley. She'd been traveling for 3 days. She'd had money when she started, not much, but enough. And then she hadn't had money anymore, and she'd stopped being willing to say why or how. She'd been trying to reach her aunt in a town called Mill Haven, 2 days further west. But the storm had come faster than expected, and she'd gotten turned around in the dark and ended up here. The baby's name was Mia. She was 4 months old. The father, Lydia said this once, quickly, and then did not say it again, was not in the picture. Ethan didn't push. He heated broth, he found the softest cloth he had to warm the infant, and he let Lydia talk at whatever pace she needed to talk. He noticed she kept glancing at the door, not because she wanted to leave, but the way people check an exit when they've learned the hard way that exits matter. He noticed she didn't eat the food he put in front of her until he moved away from the table and gave her room. He noticed she positioned herself between him and the baby at all times, even after the worst of the fear had started leaving her face. He didn't say anything about any of it. By midnight, Mia was breathing more evenly, and Lydia's color had come back to something closer to normal. She was sitting close to the fire, the baby in her arms, and she had drunk 2 cups of broth and eaten half a pan of cornbread that Ethan had made from what was in the pantry. She looked exhausted in a way that sleep probably couldn't fix. You can have the room at the top of the stairs, Ethan said. There's a lock on the door. Use it if it makes you easier. Lydia looked at him. Why are you doing this? He didn't have a polished answer ready. He thought about it for a moment, actually thought about it, rather than reaching for something that sounded right. It's cold, he finally said. And you were in my barn. It wasn't eloquent, it was honest. She studied him another moment, then looked down at Mia. We'll be gone before you wake up. You don't have to be. Mr. Walker, Ethan. She looked up. You don't have to be gone by morning, he said again. The storm isn't breaking until afternoon at earliest. Stay until the roads are clear. After that, you do whatever you need to do. She didn't argue with him. She was too tired to argue. She took the baby upstairs, and Ethan heard the small click of the lock a few minutes later, and he sat back down by the fire and stared at it. He was aware that something had shifted in the house. Not dramatically, not in any way he could name precisely, just that the quality of the quiet was different than it had been 3 hours ago. Less like punishment, more like waiting. Morning came gray and bitter cold, the storm still throwing itself against the walls, and Lydia was not gone. She came downstairs while he was making coffee, the baby in her arms, and she stopped in the kitchen doorway like she hadn't entirely decided whether to cross the threshold. Storm's still bad, she said. It is, he agreed. She came to the table and sat down, and he put a cup of coffee in front of her and one in front of the place where she set Mia down wrapped in a blanket. They sat in silence for a while. Not uncomfortable silence, just the silence of two people who don't know each other yet but are starting to figure out the shape of the space between them. "You know they're going to talk," Lydia said finally. She wasn't looking at him. She was looking at the baby. "People in town, when they find out a woman stayed here." "I know," Ethan said. "It'll cause you trouble." "Probably." She looked up at him then. "And you don't care?" He thought about Harold Marsh, who he'd known since they were boys, and who had opinions about everything and shared all of them freely. He thought about the women on the church committee who kept the social ledger of Calverton and forgave very little. He thought about what Clara would have said, which was almost certainly, "Ethan Walker, you stop standing there calculating and you help that woman." "I care what's right," he said. "I care less about what people say about it." Lydia was quiet for a moment. "You're not what I expected," she said, "when I saw you in the barn." "What did you expect?" She almost smiled. Almost. "Someone who'd call the sheriff." "The sheriff's 12 miles out and probably snowed in," he said. "And even if he wasn't, you haven't done anything wrong." "Not everyone would see it that way." "No," he agreed. "Not everyone would." It was a simple conversation, ordinary even. But something in it mattered. Some line was established there at that kitchen table, between two people who were both more alone than they'd wanted to be for longer than was good for either of them. The storm lasted 2 more days. By the end of those 2 days, Ethan knew that Lydia was stubborn and proud and had a harder edge than she initially showed, and that she'd been hurt by someone in a way she was not ready to name, and that she sang quietly to the baby when she thought Ethan couldn't hear, and that she had a practical intelligence about her. She noticed things, fixed things, asked useful questions about the ranch without being asked. And Lydia knew that Ethan was a man who'd been scraped hollow by grief and had rebuilt himself around routine and distance, and that he was careful, not cold, but careful, with everything he let himself want, and that he'd loved people once with his whole self and had not entirely recovered from losing them. When the storm finally broke and the roads cleared enough to travel, Lydia did not bring up leaving. And Ethan did not bring it up either. She stayed. They didn't discuss it formally. It happened the way some of the most important things happen, not with a conversation, but with a series of small moments that accumulate into a fact. She helped with the morning chores without being asked. He added another chair to the table without commenting on it. Mia began to sleep better in the warm house, and her cries, when they came, stopped feeling like an intrusion and started feeling like something that belonged in these walls. Calverton noticed. It took about a week before the first person said something directly. Vera Aldis, who ran the dry goods counter on behalf of her husband and had strong views about propriety, waited until Ethan came in for supplies and then delivered her verdict while weighing out flour. "People are talking," she said without preamble. "People usually are," Ethan said, "about the woman at your place. She had nowhere to go. It was 40 below. He set his list on the counter. "I need 2 pounds of salt, a pound of coffee, and whatever cornmeal you have left." Vera set down the flour scoop and looked at him directly. "Ethan Walker, you are going to ruin yourself." He met her eyes. "Then I'll be ruined," he said. "Salt, coffee, and cornmeal, Vera, please." She filled the order. She didn't speak to him again beyond what the transaction required. He drove home through the cold, the supplies in the back of the wagon, and when he came through the door, Lydia was at the stove and Mia was in the crate he'd padded with blankets that served as a crib, and the kitchen was warm, and something inside him settled. He had not felt that particular settling in a very long time. He should have known then, probably did know, somewhere underneath where he was willing to look, that he was not going to send them away. That the cost, whatever it turned out to be, was something he was already choosing to pay. He just hadn't admitted it out loud yet. 3 weeks after the storm, Harold Marsh arrived at the door for the first time. He came alone that first time, which in its way was more frightening than the group that would come later, because Harold alone meant he still thought this was a matter of quiet persuasion, of one reasonable man talking sense to another. Ethan stepped onto the porch and pulled the door shut behind him. "I'll say it plain," Harold said. "The elders of the church have asked me to come. This situation," he gestured vaguely, "cannot continue. An unmarried woman, a child of unknown origin, living in your home. It reflects badly on you. It reflects badly on all of us." "She's a guest," Ethan said. "A person in need. She's a scandal, Harold said, and you're making it worse every day you allow it. Ethan looked at him for a long moment. Harold had known him for 30 years, had stood beside him at Claire's grave, had shaken his hand and said, "If there's anything I can do," and then, like most people who say such things, had done nothing at all. "I appreciate you coming, Harold," Ethan said. "I do. But my roof, my land, my decision?" Harold's jaw tightened. "You're being a fool." "Maybe," Ethan said. "Go home. It's cold." He went back inside. But when he turned from the door, Lydia was standing at the bottom of the stairs. She had heard. From the look on her face, she had heard everything. "I'll start packing," she said quietly. "You won't," Ethan said. "Ethan, Lydia." He said her name with a firmness that surprised even him. "You're not leaving because Harold Marsh has opinions. That's not a good enough reason." She stared at him. The baby made a small sound upstairs. "He's going to come back," she said. "I know. He's going to bring people with him. I know that too. And you're still—" She stopped. "Why?" He didn't answer right away. He went to the kitchen and poured himself a cup of coffee and stood at the window looking out at the frozen yard. She followed him as far as the doorway and waited. "Because I was alone in this house for 10 years, he said finally, "and I had convinced myself that was fine, that I deserved it maybe, or that I'd just outlived anything better." He looked at the coffee cup. "And then you were in my barn, and now the house doesn't feel the same, and I'm not willing to go back to what it was before." The silence that followed was long. "That's a lot of weight to put on two people you've known 3 weeks, she said. Her voice was careful. Not rejecting, careful. "I know," he said. "I'm not saying it right. I don't mean—" He stopped, started again. "I mean, the house feels like a house again. That's all. Whatever happens from here." She looked at him for a long moment. Then she went back to the kitchen and started supper. And that was enough, for now. That was the beginning of the thing they were both pretending not to see clearly yet, and the beginning of the fight that was coming for them, and the beginning of something that, if it survived what was coming, might be worth everything the coming of it cost. The men came before dawn, Harold Marsh and 6 others, lanterns and cold breath and certainty on their faces. And Ethan Walker stood in his doorway, his shoulder against the frame, and listened to them tell him to throw out the woman and child who had made his empty house a home. Behind him, in the room at the top of the stairs, behind a locked door she no longer needed to lock, Mia stirred in her sleep. Ethan said nothing for a long moment. Then he said, "I think you should all go home." Harold's face hardened. "We're not going anywhere until—" "I heard you the first time," Ethan said quietly. "My answer is no. Go home, Harold." He stepped back inside. He closed the door. And he stood in the dark hallway, listening to the sound of the men on his porch, and the sound of the wind, and the sound of a baby breathing somewhere above him. And he made the decision he had probably already made weeks ago. The decision that everything from here would hang on. He was not going to move. They were going to have to. Harold Marsh did not go home. Not right away. Ethan heard them on the porch for another 10 minutes. Low voices, Harold's carrying clearest, the words not quite audible through the door, but the tone unmistakable. The tone of men recalculating, deciding how far they were willing to push and what it would cost them if they pushed wrong. Then the boots moved off the porch, crunching back across the frozen ground, and the lantern light faded from the gap under the door, and the yard went dark again. Ethan stood in the hallway until he was certain they were gone. Then he went to the kitchen and built the fire up and put water on to boil, because it was nearly 5 in the morning and sleep was not something that was going to happen now, and because having something to do with his hands was the only way he knew to slow his thinking down to a manageable speed. He was on his second cup of coffee when he heard the stairs creak. Lydia came into the kitchen wrapped in the wool blanket from the room upstairs, her hair loose, Mia against her shoulder. The baby was awake but quiet, dark eyes moving around the kitchen with that particular infant curiosity that seemed to find everything equally interesting. The ceiling, the stove, Ethan's face. Lydia sat down across from him without being asked. She didn't say anything for a moment. She looked at the table, then at the window where the sky was just beginning to go from black to the dark gray that meant dawn was thinking about it. "How many were there?" she asked. 7. She nodded slowly, like she was filing that number somewhere for later use. Harold Marsh, she said. Who else? Pete Dorsey, the Aldis brothers. Tom Crail and his boy. He paused. Reverend Hicks. At that she looked up sharply. The Reverend came. He stood at the back, didn't say much. Ethan wrapped both hands around his cup. I don't think he was entirely comfortable being there, but he came. Lydia was quiet for a moment. The baby made a small sound and she shifted her, patted her back twice, and Mia settled again. They'll come back, Lydia said. Not a question. Yes. With more people. Probably. She looked at him directly. In the early morning light, without the guardedness she wore during the day like a second coat, she looked younger and more tired and more real than she usually allowed herself to appear. I need you to tell me something honestly, she said. All right. Is there any part of you, any part at all, that wishes we'd never come to your barn? He considered the question the way it deserved to be considered, rather than dismissing it quickly with something reassuring. No, he said, not a part. She studied his face, checking for the lie. She had learned to look for lies. He'd understood that about her early on, the way she measured words before she trusted them, the way she watched a person's eyes rather than listening purely to what their mouth said. Whatever she saw in his face, she seemed to accept it. I don't want to be the reason you lose things you've spent your whole life building, she said. You're not the reason, he said. Harold Marsh and his opinion of what's proper is the reason. There's a difference. She almost said something else, then didn't. She looked down at Mia instead, and he could see her working through something privately, turning it over, not ready to put it into words yet. He didn't push. He refilled his coffee and let the kitchen be quiet in the way that had started to feel over these past weeks, less like emptiness and more like something shared. The sun came up cold and flat, and the day began. It was a week before Harold made his next move, and when he didn't come to the ranch. He went to every other place in Calverton instead. Ethan learned about it in pieces. First from Amos Reed, who ran the livery stable and who told Ethan without particular judgment that Harold had been talking to people. Just talking, he said, the way Harold always talked, which meant he was building something and laying the foundation one conversation at a time. Then from Margaret Tully at the post office, who pressed her lips together when Ethan came in and handed him his mail without her usual questions about how the cattle were doing. Then from the fact that when he walked the length of Main Street that Thursday, 3 people who would ordinarily have nodded to him looked away instead. He came home and said nothing about it to Lydia. But she knew. She always seemed to know when something had shifted in the temperature of things, even when she hadn't been there to witness the shift directly. She was hanging wet laundry near the stove when he came in, a task she'd taken over without discussion, like she'd taken over a dozen other tasks, slipping into the routine of the ranch the way water finds its level. And she looked at him once and said, "Bad day in town." It wasn't a question. "Manageable," he said. She didn't pursue it. She went back to the laundry, and Ethan went to change his boots, and they ate supper that night mostly in silence with Mia in the blanket crate between them. And it was, despite everything, one of the more peaceful evenings he could remember in a very long time, which troubled him in a way he hadn't fully sorted out. That peace could coexist with something gathering outside the walls of this house, like weather. The trouble with Lydia staying was not any one incident. It was the accumulation. It was the way the feed merchant in Calverton told Ethan, apologetically but firmly, that his credit account would need to be settled in full before any new supplies went out. It was the way the invitation to the Tanner family's winter social, an invitation Ethan had received without fail for 15 years, did not arrive this year. It was the way Pastor Hicks, who was a more complicated man than his presence at Harold's midnight gathering suggested, stopped Ethan after services one Sunday with a look on his face that was genuinely pained rather than condemnatory. "I'm not against you, Ethan," the pastor said quietly, so the people filing out around them wouldn't hear. "I want you to understand that." "I hear you," Ethan said, "but there is a way to handle this that preserves everyone's dignity. The woman could be found a proper situation, the child placed appropriately. You could—" "No," Ethan said, simply, without heat. The pastor looked at him for a long moment. "You've made up your mind." "I have. Even knowing what it's going to cost." Ethan pulled his hat on. I'd rather know what I'm losing than not know what I'm giving up. He walked out into the cold. What he hadn't said to the pastor, hadn't said to anyone, was that the cost had already been calculated and accepted somewhere in the part of his mind he didn't examine too carefully. He had lost Clara. He had lost Thomas. He had survived it by turning himself into a man who didn't need much and didn't expect anything. That version of himself had been functional. It had not been alive. He was not going back to it. The second week of February brought a cold snap that drove the temperature down far enough that the water in the barn troughs froze overnight despite the heat lamps Ethan kept running, and he spent 3 mornings in a row breaking ice before the horses could drink. Lydia started coming out to help without being asked. She was not experienced with livestock. She'd told him she'd grown up in a town, not on a ranch. But she learned fast, and she didn't pretend to know things she didn't know, which Ethan respected more than competence would have earned. "This one," he said one morning, nodding at the bay mare who stood at the far side of the stall and pinned her ears whenever Lydia came too close. "Don't approach her straight on. Come in from the side and don't look directly at her." Lydia, who had been reaching toward the mare's nose with what she clearly intended as a friendly gesture, stopped. "Why?" "She doesn't trust direct approaches. Something happened to her before I bought her. I don't know what." He stepped in from the side himself, let the mare smell his glove, waited. "She's not mean. She's just been taught to expect the worst." Lydia watched. "How long did it take her to trust you?" "About 8 months." She was quiet for a moment. Then she stepped to the side and approached the mare the way he'd shown her, and the horse shifted but didn't retreat, and the ear came down halfway from its pinned position. 8 months, Lydia said softly, more to herself than to him. He didn't respond to that, but he thought about it later back in the house, while he was patching a piece of harness, and Lydia was reading from the one book she'd been carrying when she arrived. A battered thing with no cover, the first pages missing, so he still didn't know the title. And Mia was sleeping with the concentrated intensity that babies bring to the activity, like sleeping is a job they are serious about. He thought about the mare and about 8 months, and about the patience required to wait for a creature to decide, on its own schedule, and nobody else's, that maybe it was safe. He was not a patient man by nature. He had made himself into one the hard way. He thought that might be the most important thing he and Lydia Carter had in common, though neither of them had said it out loud. The thing that changed the direction of everything, not all at once, but in the way a river changes direction, gradually and then with increasing force, was the letter. It arrived in the 3rd week of February, addressed to Lydia in a hand she recognized before she even opened it, because she went pale when he handed it to her and stood very still for a moment before she took it from him. She read it in her room. He didn't ask what it said. She told him that evening, after supper, after Mia was down, sitting across from him at the kitchen table with the letter on the table between them, face down, like she didn't want it looking at either of them. The man who had fathered Mia knew where she was. His name was Douglas Farrell, and he was the son of a wealthy family 2 counties east. Wealthy enough that when Lydia had worked in their house as a seamstress, and he had decided she was available to him, and she had discovered she was carrying his child and had gone to his family, hoping for acknowledgement, his mother had paid her to leave and told her that if she ever mentioned the Farrell name in connection with her son's child, she would see to it that Lydia was prosecuted for theft. The charge was invented, but the threat was real. So Lydia had left. She'd been trying to get far enough away that the Farrell name stopped mattering. She was not, apparently, far enough. "He's not coming himself," she said, her voice very level, the way a person's voice goes level when they are keeping it from shaking through sheer force of discipline. "The letter is from his lawyer. They want Mia." Ethan set down his coffee cup. "They want to take the child. They want proof that she's being raised in appropriate circumstances." Lydia's jaw moved. "Which is the polite way of saying they want to find a reason to take her." "Why? If they denied she existed." "His mother died in January." Lydia picked up the letter, then set it back down without turning it over. "The oldest son inherits and the younger ones get settled. Douglas is the younger one. He wants—" She stopped. "He wants an heir. A legitimate one eventually, I imagine, but in the meantime, he wants the child he refused to acknowledge," Ethan said. "Yes." The silence in the kitchen was a different kind now, heavier. The fire in the stove made its small sounds, and outside the wind moved along the eaves of the house, and Mia slept upstairs unaware that somewhere a lawyer had put her name in a letter. "What does the lawyer say exactly?" Ethan asked. "What are they claiming?" "That she is being raised in unsuitable conditions. That a single woman of no means living in a questionable arrangement with an unmarried man." She said it flatly, without embarrassment, because they both knew that was how it would read to the right judge. "That it constitutes neglect." Ethan stood up. He didn't go anywhere. He just needed to be standing rather than sitting. He went to the window and looked out at the dark yard and thought about Harold Marsh and his 7 men and his campaign of quiet pressure through the town. And he thought about Douglas Farrell's lawyer, who would also know how to apply pressure. And he thought about the 2 separate directions the pressure was coming from and how Lydia was standing at the point where they converged. "How much time does the letter give you?" he asked. 30 days to respond." "To respond how?" "With evidence that Mia is in a stable home, with a proper guardian." She paused. The lawyer's definition of proper is made fairly clear. Ethan turned from the window. "He means a husband." Lydia met his eyes. "He means a husband with property and standing. Yes." The word hung in the kitchen air between them. Neither of them moved for a moment. The fire ticked. The house settled around them in the particular way old houses settle in hard cold. "I'm not saying that," Lydia said quickly, and her voice had changed, pulled back, gone careful. "I'm not saying that as a... I just wanted you to understand the whole of what we're facing. You deserve to know." "I know," he said. "Sit down." "Ethan." "Sit down, Lydia. We're going to figure this out." She sat. He sat back down across from her, and they spent the next 2 hours going through it. What the letter actually required, what proof might satisfy it, what a response from Ethan as, he said it carefully, someone vouching for the stability of the household might accomplish in the short term. Whether there was a lawyer in Calverton willing to help them, given the current climate of opinion. That last question had an uncertain answer. By the time they'd finished, it was past 10, and Lydia's eyes were red at the edges from tiredness, or something else she hadn't let become crying. She gathered up the letter and folded it and put it in her coat pocket. "I never asked for this to be your problem," she said. "I know you didn't. It's not fair to you." "A lot of things aren't fair," he said. "That doesn't always mean you walk away from them." She looked at him in that way she had, measuring, serious, as if she were reading something written in very small print. "You are a strange man, Ethan Walker," she said. "I've been told." Something that wasn't quite a smile moved across her face and was gone. She went upstairs. He stayed at the table for another hour, alone with his coffee gone cold and the letter's contents moving through his mind in slow rotation. He was not a lawyer. He did not know the exact shape of what Douglas Farrell could actually do versus what his lawyer had been paid to suggest he could do. Those were different things, usually. What a wealthy man threatened, and what he was actually able to accomplish when the threat was tested. But the threat was real enough to need answering, and answering it would require navigating both the Farrell situation and the Calverton situation at the same time, which was, he was honest with himself about this, more complicated than anything he'd dealt with in a long time. He was also honest with himself about something else. He had told Lydia that his answer to her question, "Any part of you that wishes they'd never come," was no. And that was true. But the fuller truth, the one he hadn't gotten near yet in words, was that the house feeling like a house again was not all of it. Not anywhere close to all of it. He was not going to think too carefully about the rest of it. Not yet. That particular door needed to stay closed a little longer while he sorted out what was immediately on fire. He went to bed, slept poorly, and was up before light. The next morning he drove to Calverton to see Warren Ellis, who was the nearest thing the town had to a practicing attorney. Warren was 60-something, suspicious of most things, and had handled Ethan's property transactions over the years without enthusiasm but with competence. He had also, notably, not been among Harold Marsh's midnight gathering. Ethan laid out the situation, the Farrell letter, the lawyer's language, the 30-day window, and Warren listened without interrupting, which was either a good sign or the sign of a man so appalled he couldn't locate where to start. When Ethan finished, Warren turned his pen end over end on the desk twice, then set it down. "This Farrell," he said, "the family's money. Considerable, from what I understand. And the lawyer they've retained." Ethan handed over the letter, and Warren read the firm name on the heading and was quiet for a moment. "That's an Abilene firm. They handle serious work." "I know." They'll have made inquiries before sending this letter. About the situation here. About you. I know that too. Warren set the letter on the desk and folded his hands on top of it. Ethan, I'm going to ask you something and I need a straight answer. Ask. What is this woman to you? He said it without flinching because that was the kind of question Warren asked. Not maliciously. Practically. Because the answer to it changed what was possible and what wasn't. Ethan thought about the barn, about the kitchen table in the dark, broth and cornbread, and a woman who didn't eat until he moved away from the table. About 8 months. About the quality of the silence in the house now versus what it had been before. She's someone I intend to stand by, he said. Warren looked at him for a long moment over the top of his glasses. That covers a lot of territory, he said. I know what it covers. Warren picked up his pen again. All right, he said. Then sit down, because this is going to take a while. It took most of the morning. What Warren outlined was not simple or certain, but it had shape, a formal response to the feral lawyer establishing Ethan's position as, Warren chose the language carefully, a person of property and standing with a stated intention to provide stable support for the household. It wouldn't end the matter. The Farrells had money enough to keep pressing, but it would slow them, and it would reframe the situation in legal terms that were harder for them to dismiss, and it would buy time. Time for what? Warren left unasked. Ethan left the attorney's office and walked back up Main Street toward where he'd tied the horse, and he was 2 storefronts from the livery when he nearly walked into Grace Tanner. Grace was 64, the wife of the man who hadn't invited him to the winter social, and she had known Ethan's mother before his mother passed and had brought food to the house when Clara died. She had a complicated position in the social architecture of Calverton, respected enough that her opinion mattered, independent enough in her thinking that she sometimes departed from the consensus in ways that surprised people. She looked at him now with an expression he couldn't entirely read. I heard Harold paid you a visit, she said. He did. And the woman is still there. She is. Grace studied him. She had the particular quality of attention that older women develop. Not judgment exactly, but the kind of looking that sees underneath the surface detail to whatever is actually being carried. Is she a good woman, Ethan? He didn't hesitate. Yes. And the baby? Healthy now. She had a rough start. Grace was quiet for a moment. Harold is going to escalate this. You know that. I know. He's talking about calling a formal assembly, bringing it before the town. Ethan had not known that. He kept his face from showing what that information did to his thinking. And what do you think about that? He asked. Grace's mouth pressed into a line that was not quite a smile. I think Harold Marsh has been looking for something to be in charge of for a long time, she said, and I think he's chosen poorly. She pulled her coat tighter. Not everyone in this town is of the same mind as Harold. You might want to remember that. She walked away before he could respond. He stood on the frozen Main Street of Calverton and turned that over. Not everyone of the same mind. He drove home with that sitting in the back of his thoughts alongside Warren Ellis's careful legal language and Douglas Farrell's lawyer's letter, and the image of Lydia's face going pale when she saw the handwriting on the envelope. He came through the door and found Lydia at the workbench near the back window, repairing a piece of harness leather. She'd started doing that 2 days ago, working through the pile of mending equipment he'd been putting off for months, teaching herself by examination and experiment with a focused patience that he'd noticed and said nothing about. She looked up when he came in. Warren Ellis, he said. He's going to draft a response to the Farrell lawyer. It won't settle it, but it'll hold them off. She set the leather piece down. He agreed to help. He did. Even with, she gestured, meaning the town, meaning Harold, meaning the whole complicated climate of Calverton's opinion. Warren Ellis doesn't care much what Harold Marsh thinks, Ethan said. He never has. She was quiet for a moment, then she said, How much will it cost? I'll handle it. Ethan. Lydia. He said it the same way she'd said his name, firm, level, finishing the discussion. She recognized the tone because it was her own, and he could see the flicker of that recognition cross her face before she looked back down at the harness. She picked it up again and went back to work. He shrugged off his coat and went to check on Mia, who was in the blanket crate in the corner of the main room, awake, watching the ceiling with her dark eyes and waving both fists at something only she could see. He crouched down beside the crate, and the baby looked at him, and her face did the thing it had started doing in the last couple of weeks. That shift toward recognition, the beginning of what would become a smile but wasn't quite there yet, just the warm brightening of her whole expression when she saw a face she knew. He had not expected that to hit him the way it did. He stayed crouched beside the crate for longer than he'd meant to, and Mia batted at the air and watched him with her mother's serious eyes. And something in him that had been staying very still for 10 years began, carefully and not without resistance, to move. Harold's formal assembly was scheduled for the first Saturday of March. Word came through Amos Reed, who told Ethan without quite meeting his eyes, and through Margaret at the post office, who told him with her lips pressed together, and eventually through a note under his door that contained no signature but was in Harold's handwriting and requested his presence at the Calverton Meeting Hall at 2 o'clock. Lydia read the note over his shoulder. "You don't have to go," she said. "If I don't go, they'll decide everything without me being there," he said. "And if you do go, then at least I'm in the room." She was quiet for a moment. "I should go too." He looked at her. "It's about me," she said. "And Mia. We should be in the room too." He didn't argue. He understood the instinct, the need to face a thing directly rather than sit at home waiting to hear what it decided about you. He recognized it because it was his own. "All right," he said, "we'll both go." 3 days before the assembly, something happened that none of them had anticipated. Ethan was splitting wood in the side yard when he heard the wagon coming up the track. He set the axe down and watched it come. A small wagon, one horse, a figure he didn't immediately recognize at the reins. It pulled up, and the driver climbed down, and he saw it was a woman he'd never met. Perhaps 45, solid-looking, with a face that had been weathered by outdoor work and wore its lines without apology. "You Ethan Walker?" she said. "I am. I'm Ruth Cale. I farm the Brennan plot, 8 miles north. I heard what's been happening here." She pulled off her glove and held out her hand to shake. "I came to introduce myself and to tell you I've already told Harold Marsh that I plan to speak at the assembly, and not on his side." Ethan shook her hand and looked at her for a moment. "Why?" he asked. He meant it genuinely. He didn't know this woman. Ruth Cale put her glove back on with the matter-of-fact movements of a woman who didn't waste motion. "Because I came to this county 20 years ago with 2 children and nothing else. And there was nobody who stood up when people talked about me the way they're talking about her. And I'm old enough now that I'm tired of watching it happen again." She looked toward the house. "Is she inside?" "She is." "Well then," Ruth said, and walked toward the door. Ethan watched her go and felt something he hadn't felt in weeks. Something that lived in the same neighborhood as hope, though he was careful about calling it that. He picked up the axe and went back to the wood. Inside the house, he could hear Ruth Cale's voice, and then Lydia's voice, and then the quieter sounds of 2 women who'd just met talking in the unself-conscious way of people who immediately recognize each other's particular kind of tiredness, and don't need to explain it. Mia made a sound, pleased, interested, and Ruth Cale laughed. Ethan split the wood and stacked it and tried not to think too far ahead, because thinking too far ahead was how you got thrown by what actually happened. He had learned that. But he let himself think about the assembly, about the room, about standing in it with Lydia beside him, and whatever Ruth Cale and Grace Tanner and anyone else who wasn't Harold Marsh had to say. He let himself think about the Farrell letter and Warren Ellis's careful legal language and the 30-day window and the shape of what might be possible if they got through it. He did not think about the door he had not opened yet, the one that led to the fullest truth of what he'd meant when he said the house feels like a house again. He was not ready for that door. Some things needed time, and this was one of them. The assembly was 3 days away. The wood was stacked, the yard was empty and cold, and inside the house there was light in every window. The morning of the assembly, Lydia burned the eggs. It was not like her. In the weeks she had been in this house, she had quietly taken over the cooking with the same unannounced efficiency she applied to everything else. Not dramatically, not as a statement, just as the natural extension of a person who notices what needs doing and does it. The eggs had always been exactly right. That morning she stood at the stove, staring at the pan, and the eggs went black at the edges, and she didn't notice until the smell hit both of them. She pulled the pan off the heat, looked at it, set it in the dry sink without a word. "I can eat them," Ethan said. "You can't eat those." "I've eaten worse." She turned and looked at him, and there was something in her face that the burned eggs were not really about. A tightness around her eyes, a particular set to her jaw that he had come to recognize as the expression she wore when she was holding something in by force of will. "You don't have to be afraid of it," he said. "I'm not afraid." He looked at her. "I'm not," she said again, and this time it was slightly less convincing than the first. He got up and made toast, and they ate standing at the counter instead of at the table, which was different enough from their usual routine that it acknowledged something without requiring either of them to name it. Mia watched from her crate with the alert interest of a baby who has picked up on the atmospheric pressure change without understanding it. Ruth Kale arrived at noon, as she'd said she would. She came in, looked at both of them, and said briskly, "You both look like you're waiting to be hanged. Stop it. Looking beaten before you walk in the door is the same as being beaten." Lydia blinked. Then something in her face shifted. Not relaxed exactly, but recalibrated. "Good afternoon to you too, Mrs. Kale." Ruth said. She hung her coat on the peg by the door like she'd been hanging it there for years. "Who's bringing the baby?" "I am," Lydia said. Ruth looked at Ethan. Ethan nodded. "Good," Ruth said. "Let them see her. Let them look at a child and tell themselves they're doing right." They rode the three of them in Ethan's wagon, Mia bundled against Lydia's chest inside her coat, with only the top of the baby's dark-haired head visible. The sky was low and white, the particular shade of February sky that can't decide between snow and just being miserable. The road into Calverton had ruts frozen solid from the last thaw and freeze cycle, and the wagon jolted over them without apology. Ruth talked most of the way. She had a no-nonsense quality to her speech that Ethan found useful. She covered what to expect, who was likely to speak, and on which side, what Harold's probable approach would be. She had lived in this county long enough to have built up the particular kind of knowledge that comes from watching small communities conduct their politics over many years. "Harold will try to frame it as a question of morality," she said, "because that's his strongest ground. He'll try to make it about what's proper and improper, about reputation and tradition. What you need to do is shift the ground." "To what?" Lydia asked. "To the facts. A woman came out of a storm with a sick baby, and a man took them in. That's the fact. Everything else is Harold's interpretation of the fact." Ruth adjusted her coat. "You ask people to interpret facts differently. You're fighting their feelings. You show them a different fact. Sometimes they can move." The meeting hall was a rectangular wooden building behind the feed merchants on the east side of Main Street. It served as courthouse, assembly room, and occasionally as the site of dances that nobody quite admitted to enjoying as much as they did. It had a wood stove in each corner and 20 rows of benches that could seat perhaps 100 people. When they arrived, there were already 40 or 50 people inside, and more coming. Ethan drove the wagon around back and tied the horse at the post there. He helped Lydia down. She did not let him hold her arm for more than the moment required to step from the wagon to the ground, and then she straightened up and squared her shoulders and did that thing he had seen her do before, gathered herself inward, stood up taller than seemed physically possible for a woman of her height, and put on her face the expression that said, "I am here, do your worst." He had always privately admired that. "Ready?" Ruth said. Neither of them answered, which Ruth apparently took as yes, because she walked around to the front of the building and pushed the door open. The sound inside dropped by half when they walked in. Not completely. People don't go completely silent in large groups unless something genuinely shocking happens, and this was more like the drop in volume when wind changes direction. Conversations didn't stop so much as lose their focus, people's attention pulling toward the door and what had just come through it. Harold Marsh was already at the front of the room, standing near a small table that had been set up as a kind of podium. He saw Ethan come in. His expression did not change significantly, but something behind his eyes sharpened. Ethan moved to a bench on the left side, third row. Lydia sat beside him, Mia still bundled against her chest. Ruth went to sit 2 rows behind, and Ethan saw her exchange a nod with Grace Tanner, who was already there with 2 other women he recognized vaguely, wives of farmers from the northern part of the county. The room filled over the next 20 minutes. By the time Harold called things to order, there were perhaps 80 people present. Ethan knew most of them by name and history. He had grown up with some of them. He had known their parents, their children, the outlines of their lives. I was about to ask something from all of them that was harder than people made it sound. Harold's opening was precise and careful, and exactly what Ruth had predicted. He stood at the small table with his hands folded in front of him and spoke in the measured tone of a man who has rehearsed his reasonableness. He said this was not about punishing anyone. He said it was about the health of the community. He said there were standards, not arbitrary ones, but standards that held things together, that made it possible for people to trust each other and build something lasting. He said that when those standards were disregarded, everyone suffered. He did not look at Lydia directly while he said it. He didn't need to. Several people spoke after Harold. Pete Dorsey said essentially the same things Harold had said, but less articulately. A woman named Agnes Brower, who ran the boarding house and who Ethan had always thought of as reasonable, said that she felt for the woman personally, but that what was proper for reasons. And those reasons didn't go away because the situation was sympathetic. Reverend Hicks spoke carefully and said little, which in its way said a great deal. Then Ruth Cale stood up. She stood up without being called on, which was technically against the informal rules of the assembly. And Harold started to object, and Ruth looked at him with an expression so flat and unimpressed that he stopped mid-sentence and sat back in his chair. "I'm going to say something," Ruth said to the room at large. "And then you can go back to your procedure." She turned to face the benches. She had the posture of a woman who had spent 20 years working land that didn't particularly want to be worked, and it showed in every line of her. "I came here with 2 children in 1871, she said. "My husband had been dead 6 months. I had $14 and a wagon with a broken axle, and when I came through Calverton looking for supplies and work, the first 3 people I spoke to on this street told me to move along. Told me a widow woman with no connections had no business settling here." The room was quiet. "Sam Brennan gave me a job," she said. "Let me work his fields through the harvest and gave me and my children a place to sleep. Nobody in this room was half as concerned about propriety then as they seem to be now." She looked at Harold. "The difference I can see," she said, "is that Sam Brennan was an old man of 60 who nobody thought twice about, and Ethan Walker is a man of means who chose a woman people would prefer he hadn't." She let that sit for a moment. "The child doesn't care about any of this," she said. "She just needs to not freeze. I think that was obvious." She sat back down. The room had a different quality after that. Not transformed. Nothing transforms a room full of entrenched people in one speech, and anyone who tells you it does is selling something, but shifted. A few people were looking at their hands. A few were looking at Lydia. Lydia was looking straight ahead. Harold stood again and said, with the careful calm of a man rerouting, that the issue was not whether compassion was appropriate, but whether the current arrangement could continue indefinitely without formal sanction, without, as he put it, a proper accounting of what this household was and who was responsible for it. It was at that point that Ethan stood up. He had not planned exactly what he was going to say. He had thought about it, on and off, for 3 days, and had arrived at the conclusion that planning it too carefully would make it sound like it had been planned too carefully, and that what the room needed from him was not a speech, but an answer to Harold's question, a direct one. "I'll give you a proper accounting," he said. Harold looked at him. The room looked at him. "Lydia Carter came to my barn on the coldest night this winter," he said. "She and the child were going to die if I didn't bring them inside. I brought them inside." He paused. "She has been working on my ranch every day since. She is competent and honest, and she has more backbone than most people I've known my whole life." He looked at Harold. "If your question is whether this household is stable enough for a child to be raised in, the answer is yes. If your question is whether I intend to stand by Lydia and Mia regardless of what this assembly decides, the answer is also yes." Harold's jaw tightened. "Ethan, the community's concern—" "I heard the community's concern," Ethan said. "What I haven't heard is one person in this room say anything about the child's welfare that wasn't actually about something else." He turned to look at the room. Not aggressive, just direct. "I'm asking for nothing from any of you. I'm not asking for approval or permission or sanction. I'm telling you what is because you invited me here to tell you." He looked back at Harold. "That's your accounting." He sat down. The silence that followed lasted about 4 seconds, which in a room of 80 people is a significant length of silence. Then Grace Tanner said, from somewhere in the middle of the room, without standing up, "I'd say that settles it." It did not entirely settle it. Nothing ever does, entirely. But the assembly did not vote, which Harold had been pressing for because it became apparent in the discussion that followed that he did not have the votes to get what he wanted. And Harold Marsh was too careful a political operator to call a vote he was going to lose. He moved instead to table the matter, which was face-saving language for backing down, and the assembly broke up into smaller conversations that were more like the milling around of people who have been worked up and need to disperse than like the continuation of any formal proceeding. 3 people came to speak to Ethan. Amos Reed, who shook his hand without a word and then walked away. A farmer named Clay Dutton from the north side of the county, who said simply, "You did right," and moved on. And Agnes Brower, the boarding house owner, who had spoken against them in the assembly and who came to Ethan with a complicated expression and said, "I don't know if I've got this figured right or wrong, but I hope you do," and walked away before he could respond. Lydia had not spoken during the assembly, not one word. She had sat with Mia against her chest and looked straight ahead and let the room's deliberations proceed around her, and there had been something in her stillness that was harder to look at than any speech would have been. On the way out, Harold Marsh fell into step beside Ethan for a moment. "This isn't finished," Harold said quietly. "I know," Ethan said. "I mean it, Ethan. There are consequences you haven't felt yet." Ethan stopped walking. Harold stopped too. They stood just inside the door with the cold coming in from outside and the noise of the dispersing crowd around them. "Harold," Ethan said, keeping his voice level, "we have known each other our whole lives. You'd stood beside me when I buried my son. I have not forgotten that." He held Harold's gaze. "But I need you to understand something. There is nothing you can threaten me with that is worse than spending another 10 years alone in that house. Nothing. So if you have something left to bring, bring it. But know that I mean to be standing when it's done." Harold looked at him for a long moment. Something moved across his face. Not softening, not exactly, but the adjustment a person makes when they recalibrate how serious an opponent is. He walked away without another word. Ethan went outside. Lydia was at the wagon, Ruth beside her. Ruth was talking, her breath making clouds in the cold air, and Lydia was listening with the expression she wore when she was processing something that deserved more thought than she was ready to give it in the moment. When she saw Ethan coming, she said something to Ruth, and Ruth nodded and moved to unhitch her own horse from the post. Ethan helped Lydia up into the wagon without speaking. He untied the horse, climbed up himself, and they started back out of Calverton in the early afternoon cold. They were half a mile out of town before Lydia said, "Thank you." "You don't need to thank me. I'm going to anyway." He didn't argue with that. Another half mile. "What Harold said to you before you came out," she said. "I couldn't hear it, but I could see it on his face. He's not done." "No." "What else does he have?" Ethan considered how much to tell her. He had been doing that too much lately, considering how much to tell her rather than just telling her. She had made it clear she didn't want that, and he knew she was right not to want it. Handling things behind her back, even with protective intentions, was the kind of thing that would make her feel managed rather than respected, and she had been managed by enough people. "There's the Farrell situation," he said. "Warren is handling the response, but Harold knows that the Farrell lawyer is investigating the household. If he's in contact with them, or if Farrell's people are talking to the people Harold's been talking to, they could combine it," Lydia said. She understood it quickly. She always understood things quickly. "Harold makes the town's case that the situation is improper, and the Farrell lawyer uses that as evidence in the custody claim." "Yes." She was quiet for a moment. "That's actually a clever strategy. Harold's not stupid." "No," she agreed. "He's not." She looked at the road ahead. "So what do we do?" "Warren is already thinking about that. The response to the Farrell lawyer will establish," he paused, choosing the word, "a formal structure, something that addresses their language directly." Lydia looked at him. He kept his eyes on the road. "A formal structure," she said, repeating the phrase with the careful emphasis of someone who knows exactly what words can be made to mean. "We can talk about it when Warren has something written," he said. She didn't respond to that. She looked back at the road, and Mia stirred inside her coat, and they rode the rest of the way home in a silence that had a lot in it that neither of them was quite ready to put into words yet. That evening, after Mia was asleep and the dishes were done and the fire built up for the night, Lydia did not go upstairs. She sat at the kitchen table with the book she'd been reading, still missing its cover, still with its first pages gone. And Ethan sat across from her with the supply ledger he'd been meaning to update for 2 weeks. They sat like that for an hour in the lamplight, each occupied with their separate thing, and it was, he thought, one of the more honest hours he'd spent in a long time. Not performed, not managed, just two people in a kitchen being exactly where they were. Lydia set down her book. "Can I ask you something?" she said. "Yes?" "At the assembly, when you stood up." She folded her hands on the book. "You said you intended to stand by us regardless of what they decided." She looked at him steadily. "What did you mean by that exactly?" He put down the ledger. He had known this question was coming. He had known it since he'd said the words, actually, because saying them out loud in front of 80 people had made them more real than they'd been when they were just something he knew internally. Saying a thing out loud changes it, makes it require explanation. "I meant what I said," he told her. "I know you did. I'm asking what you meant." He was quiet for a moment, not avoiding it, just making sure what he said was what he actually meant, because she deserved that precision. "When Clara and Thomas died," he said, "I made myself into a man who didn't need anything, because needing things was—" He stopped, started again. "When you lose everything, the conclusion you reach is that wanting things is the problem. So you stop wanting." He looked at the lamp flame rather than at her. "You and Mia came into this house, and something in me that I thought was completely finished started functioning again, and I didn't know what to do with that. I still don't entirely know what to do with it." He looked at her. "But standing by you, that part I know. That part I'm certain about." She looked at him for a long time. "I've been let down by people who were certain," she said. "I know. Douglas Farrell was very certain. I know that too." The lamp flickered. Outside, the wind moved along the house, that familiar sound of February wind in old wood. "I'm not asking you to trust me the way you would if you'd known me for years," Ethan said. "I know that's not where we are. I'm just telling you the truth of where I am." He picked up the ledger again because he needed something to do with his hands. "What you do with that is yours to decide." Lydia sat with that for a while. Then she opened her book and went back to reading, and Ethan went back to the ledger. And the kitchen held the particular quiet of two people who have put something important into the air between them and are now giving it room. She went upstairs at 9:30. She did not lock the door. He heard that, the absence of the small click that had become so habitual in the first weeks that he hadn't consciously registered it until it stopped happening. He sat with the ledger in his lap, listening to the house settle around him, and allowed himself carefully to understand what that meant. Not everything. Not a resolution. Just that the 8 months the mayor had required was perhaps not going to be the measure here. The letter from Warren Ellis arrived 4 days later. It was not the response to the Farrell lawyer that was still being drafted. This was a separate letter, and its contents were enough that Warren had sent a writer with it rather than waiting for the regular post. The Farrell family's attorney had filed a preliminary petition in the county court at Abilene. They were claiming that Mia was being raised in conditions of moral deficiency and requesting a court assessment of the household. The 30-day window had closed faster than Warren had expected because the Farrells had moved before Warren's response was ready. There was a court date, 6 weeks away. Ethan read the letter twice at the kitchen table, then set it down. Lydia was outside in the yard with Mia, wrapped in her heavy coat, doing the things she'd taken to doing in the afternoons. Walking the yard with the baby and talking to her in low, continuous commentary about whatever she was looking at. He'd listened from the window sometimes without meaning to. The running account of a mother explaining the world to someone too young to understand the words, but old enough to be soothed by the voice. He went to the door and opened it. "Lydia." She turned. She must have read something in his face because she came toward him immediately. And when he held out the letter, she took it and read it standing in the cold yard, Mia against her shoulder. He watched her face while she read. She was not someone who showed things easily on her face. He'd learned to read the smaller signals, the way her breathing changed, the particular tension that appeared in her left hand when she was working hard to control herself. He saw both now. She looked up. 6 weeks, she said. "Yes." "Warren, what does he—" "He's going to write to me separately about that. This was to tell us about the petition." He paused. "The petition describes the household as—" He stopped. "I can read," she said. She looked back at the letter. Her jaw was tight. She read the language the lawyer had used, the language that turned everything that had happened in this house over the past 2 months into evidence of impropriety. She read the description of herself as a woman of questionable character. She read the phrase inappropriate domestic arrangement applied to two people who had shared nothing more intimate than meals and long evenings of silence and one honest conversation that had cost both of them something. She folded the letter and held it against her coat. "I need a minute," she said. He nodded and stepped back inside. He left the door slightly open and put the kettle on. And through the gap he could see her standing in the yard with her back to him, very still, her free hand pressed flat against her own sternum, the way people sometimes press against a pain they're trying to hold in. She stood like that for perhaps 5 minutes. Then she turned around and came back inside. He handed him the letter and sat down and put both hands on the table in front of her, palms down, and looked at them. "There's something you need to know," she said. "About the Farrells." He sat down. "Douglas's mother, the one who paid me to leave, she didn't just give me money. She was choosing her words with visible care. She had me sign something. I was scared and I didn't read it carefully, and I signed it." She looked up. "I don't know exactly what it said. I've been trying to remember and I can't reconstruct all of it, but I remember enough to know it might be something they're planning to use." The kitchen was very quiet. "What kind of something?" Ethan asked. "I think—" She stopped. "I think it might have been an agreement to make no claims on the Farrell family. And Mia—" Her voice tightened. "Mia might count as a claim." Ethan was still for a moment. "Where is this document now?" he asked. "With them. They kept it. I signed it, and they kept both copies." She looked at the table. "I was 21 years old, and I'd just been told I would be prosecuted for theft if I didn't sign it. I wasn't thinking about the legal weight of it." A muscle moved in her jaw. "I was thinking about getting out." He understood. He also understood that this changed the shape of what Warren Ellis was working with, and that Warren needed to know about it as soon as possible. He said both of those things, and Lydia nodded, and then she looked at him and said, "If they use that document, if a judge reads it and decides it means what I think it might mean, then we fight the document," he said, "signed under duress without proper legal counsel. Warren can argue that." "Warren can try to argue that." "Yes." He didn't soften it. "Warren can try to argue that." She looked at him. He held her gaze and didn't look away and didn't offer her more certainty than he had. She nodded once, accepted it. That was the thing about her he had come to understand. She didn't want comfort that wasn't real. She would rather know the exact shape of the bad thing than be shielded from it. She was braver, he thought, than most people he'd ever met, and not because she was fearless, but because she was afraid and went forward anyway. He drove to Warren Ellis the next morning. Warren read the new information, asked several careful questions, wrote everything down, and was quiet for a long moment after Ethan finished. "The document," Warren said, "signed under duress. We can argue that. It won't be easy. The Farrells' firm will have anticipated that argument and prepared for it." He turned his pen over twice. "What would help is if we can establish clearly and unambiguously that this household is stable. Not just argued, documented. Something the court has to acknowledge rather than dismiss." "What kind of documentation?" Ethan asked. Warren looked at him over his glasses. "Ethan," he said, "you know what kind." The silence in the office was long. "It would need to be her decision," Ethan said. "Entirely hers." "Of course it would. And it can't be proposed as a legal strategy. That's not—" He stopped. Warren studied him. "No," the attorney said, more gently than was his usual register. "It can't be that." Ethan stood and picked up his hat. "I'll think about how to—" He stopped again. Warren said nothing, which was the most useful thing he could have done. Ethan went out into the cold Calverton street and stood for a moment looking at nothing in particular. He was thinking about a conversation that needed to happen, about words that could not be practical, could not be strategic, could not be anything other than exactly what they were. He was thinking about how to say a true thing in a way that made it clear it was true without sounding like a man who had been coached by a lawyer. He was thinking about Lydia, sitting at the kitchen table with her palms flat on the surface and her eyes telling the truth whether she wanted them to or not. He drove home through the cold. The sky had gone from white to a darker gray that meant snow was coming, probably by evening. He came through the door. The house was warm. Mia was in her crate, asleep, and Lydia was at the workbench mending a shirt of his she'd found with a tear in the sleeve, a thing he hadn't asked her to do and that she'd done anyway. She looked up. He hung up his coat and his hat. He stood for a moment at the edge of the room. "There's something I want to say to you," he said. "And I need you to know before I say it that it has nothing to do with Warren Ellis or the Farrell petition or the court date or any of it." She set down the shirt. She looked at him with the full, careful attention she brought to things that mattered. He crossed the room. He sat down across from her at the workbench, on the low stool that was there, so they were nearly the same height. He folded his hands in front of him because that was what he did when he was being as honest as he knew how to be. "I am not good at this," he said. "I was, once, before. I don't know how much of that I've still got." He looked at her steadily. "But I know I don't want to be in this house without you in it. And I know that's not a small thing for either of us, and I'm not asking you to take it lightly." He paused. "I'm asking you if there's any part of what you feel about being here, about this, about us, whatever this is, that's something you'd be willing to let become more." The snow started outside, hitting the window in the first tentative sifts of a coming storm. Lydia looked at him for a long time. She did not answer quickly, which was right, which was the only way she would do anything that mattered. And then she said, in the voice she used when she was not pretending, not managing, not holding anything in, "Ask me properly, Ethan." He took a breath. And he did. She said yes. Not immediately. Not the way people say yes to things that don't cost them anything. She sat with it for a moment that was long enough that he felt every second of it, and he did not rush her, because rushing her would have meant he didn't understand what he was asking. Then she said yes in the quiet, direct way she said everything that was real, and the snow came down outside the window, and neither of them said anything else for a while. That was the proposal. No ring, no kneeling, no speech prepared in advance. A man on a low stool and a woman with a half-mended shirt in her lap, and snow starting outside. It was not a moment anyone would write songs about. It was theirs, which made it more than enough. They told Ruth Cale the next morning when she came by with a repaired piece of equipment she'd borrowed from Ethan's barn 2 weeks prior. Ruth set the equipment down inside the door, looked at both of them once, and said, "Well, finally." Then she asked when the wedding was, and they said they hadn't gotten that far. And Ruth sat down at the kitchen table and informed them that getting that far was something they were going to do right now because 6 weeks was not very long, and Warren Ellis would need legal documentation before the court date if it was going to do any good. Ruth was not a romantic woman. She was a practical one. Both qualities were useful. Warren Ellis was told that same afternoon. He received the information with a nod and the controlled expression of a man who does not permit himself visible relief in professional settings, and then he immediately began talking about what documentation was required and in what order, which Ethan took as his version of satisfaction. The wedding date was set for the last Friday of February. Not a church wedding. Pastor Hicks had not been asked, and Ethan did not intend to ask him, given his performance at the assembly, but a civil ceremony conducted by Judge Alderton, who held court in Calverton twice a month and who owed Ethan nothing and had no strong opinions about him in either direction, which was about the best you could hope for from a judge. There was no announcement put in the paper. There was no formal invitation sent to anyone. But in a town the size of Calverton, decisions of this kind travel faster without an announcement than they would with one. And by Wednesday morning, 2 days after the decision was made, the information had reached Harold Marsh. Ethan knew because Harold came to the ranch. He came alone, mid-morning, riding rather than driving, which meant it was an impulse visit rather than a planned one. He tied his horse at the post by the gate and stood there for a moment before walking toward the house, and Ethan watched him from the window and went to meet him on the porch before he could knock. Harold looked older in the winter light than he had at the assembly. Something in his face had settled into a different arrangement since then. Still the same Harold, still carrying the same convictions, but with a quality of tiredness behind his eyes that hadn't been there before. "I heard," Harold said. "I figured you would." Harold was quiet for a moment, looking at the yard, at the barn, at the details of the ranch he had known for 30 years. "You've made up your mind." "I made it up a while ago," Ethan said. "The rest was just getting the words right." Harold looked at him. "She's going to hurt you." "Maybe." "You don't know anything about where she came from, what she's carrying." I know enough, Ethan said. And what I don't know, I'll find out the regular way, same as everyone. Harold pressed his lips together. He had the look of a man who has rehearsed an argument and can see it isn't going to land the way he planned. The Farrell business is going to follow you, even after you marry. A court petition doesn't just go away. I know that, Ethan said. Warren is handling it. Warren Ellis is one attorney in a small town. The Farrells have... Harold, Ethan said it quietly, but with enough weight to stop him. Why did you come here? Not to tell me about the Farrells. You knew about them before today. Harold was silent. Is this about her? Ethan asked. Or is this about something else? Harold looked at the ground. A muscle moved in his jaw. When he looked back up, something had shifted in his expression. Not an apology, not quite, but the look of a man standing at the edge of one and not sure he can bring himself to step all the way in. Clara was a good woman, Harold said. She deserved better than what happened to her. And I always thought you deserved... He stopped. Deserved what? Harold didn't answer directly. He put his hat back on his head and looked at the house. I hope it works, he said finally. That's all. I hope it works. He walked back to his horse. He mounted and rode away without looking back, and Ethan stood on the porch watching him go and turned that over in his mind. The complicated truth that even the people making your life difficult sometimes have reasons that are more human than you've given them credit for. It didn't excuse anything, but it made the shape of the thing more honest. He went back inside. Lydia was at the table feeding Mia, who had graduated in recent weeks from Lydia's careful preparation of softened food to the active and opinionated consumption of it. Mia had strong feelings about what she was willing to eat and expressed these feelings without hesitation, which Lydia navigated with the patient firmness of a woman who had learned quickly that a baby's will is not a negotiating partner, it is simply a fact of the universe you work around. Harold, Lydia said without looking up. Harold. What did he want? Ethan sat down. I'm not entirely sure. I think maybe he came to tell me he's stopping. Lydia looked up at that. Stopping? He didn't say it that way, but that's what I heard. She looked at him for a moment, then back at Mia, who had decided that the spoon was more interesting than its contents and had taken hold of it with both fists. I'll believe it when I see it, Lydia said. That's fair. It doesn't change anything with the Farrells regardless. No, he agreed, it doesn't. She extracted the spoon from Mia with the practiced efficiency of someone who has learned exactly the angle and speed required. Mia registered her displeasure briefly and then was distracted by the return of food, and the crisis passed. Lydia glanced up at Ethan with the expression she sometimes wore after managing Mia's more dramatic moments. Not quite amusement, but close to it. She's stubborn, Lydia said. Wonder where she gets it. Lydia gave him a look that contained several things, including the acknowledgement that this was probably fair, and went back to the task at hand. It was, Ethan thought, a very ordinary moment. A kitchen, a baby, a spoon, two people making small remarks to each other in the easy cadence of people who have stopped being careful with every word. He was aware of it in the way you're sometimes aware of ordinary things, suddenly and with more clarity than seems proportionate. The awareness of a man who has lived in the absence of this for long enough to understand exactly what it's worth. He got up and poured himself coffee and let the moment be what it was. The Friday arrived cold but clear, which in late February felt like a concession from the weather. The sky was the pale, sharp blue that comes after a long stretch of gray, and the light had a quality to it that made everything look slightly more defined than usual. The fence posts, the bare trees, the road into Calverton, the courthouse building with its weathered sign. Judge Alderton was a compact man in his late 50s with the manner of someone who has performed ceremonies of every variety and finds them equally straightforward as administrative events, which in its way was exactly right for what Ethan and Lydia needed. He conducted the ceremony in his office rather than the courtroom, a room with a desk and 3 chairs and a window overlooking the back alley of Calverton, which did not qualify as a romantic setting by any measure, but which was private and warm and required nothing of either of them except to be present and mean it. Ruth Cale was there as witness. She wore her good coat, which was charcoal gray, and had buttons that appeared to have been recently polished, and she held Mia throughout the ceremony with the matter-of-fact competence of a woman who had raised children of her own and understood exactly how to contain a baby who would otherwise attempt to participate actively in proceedings she had no business participating in. Mia, for her part, seemed to find the judge's mustache fascinating and spent most of the ceremony staring at it with intense focus. Ethan had not worn his good suit in 2 years. It was slightly looser on him than it had been the last time, which he'd noticed when he put it on, and which Lydia had noticed when he came downstairs and had said nothing about, which he appreciated. Lydia wore the blue dress she'd arrived with, the one she'd folded carefully at the bottom of her bag, the one she'd kept clean through everything. It was not extravagant. It was hers, which was what mattered. She'd done something different with her hair that he couldn't have described precisely, but that made her look, not formal exactly, deliberate, like herself, but on purpose. Judge Alderton asked them the questions. They answered them. He pronounced them married with the business-like efficiency of a man moving through a checklist and signed the documentation that Warren Ellis had specified was required. And Ruth Cale signed as witness, and Mia grabbed the judge's pen with both hands and had to be retrieved, and that was that. Outside on the cold courthouse steps, Ruth hugged Lydia once, brief and firm, Ruth's version of sentiment, and shook Ethan's hand and told them both she expected supper in a week and would bring a pie. Then she handed Mia back to Lydia, mounted her horse, and rode north. Lydia stood on the courthouse steps with Mia and looked out at Calverton's main street and the people moving along it and the sky above it, and Ethan stood beside her, and neither of them said anything for a moment. "Well," Lydia said. "Well," he agreed. She glanced at him sideways. "You're not going to be the kind of husband who thinks this means I'll stop arguing with you about things." "I didn't imagine that for a second." "Good." She shifted Mia to her other hip. "Because I will still argue." "I'll do my best to hold up my end," he said. She almost smiled. She had been doing that more, almost smiling, and then occasionally actually smiling, and each time it was something he had to work to not stare at, because it transformed her face in a way that still caught him off guard. They drove home, and the road was clear, and the sky stayed blue. Warren Ellis sent his response to the Farrell attorney the following Monday. It was, by Warren's own description, a thorough document. It established Ethan's property holdings, his standing in the county, the legal status of the marriage, and Mia's position within a household of documented stability. It addressed the duress argument regarding the document Lydia had signed. It was precise and formal, and gave the Farrell attorney very little room to work with that they hadn't already anticipated. The Farrell attorney's response arrived in 10 days. They were not withdrawing the petition. Warren had expected this. He explained it to Ethan and Lydia sitting in his office on a Tuesday afternoon, Mia on Lydia's lap pulling at the buttons of Lydia's coat with methodical determination. "They've invested money in this petition," Warren said. "Withdrawing means conceding the ground they claimed publicly. The Farrells are not," he chose the word carefully, "flexible in matters of perceived status." "So we go to court," Lydia said. "We go to court," Warren confirmed. "And our position? Stronger than it was before the marriage. The court will have documentation of a stable household, property of record, a legal union." He paused. "The document you signed, I have an argument prepared. It's a good argument. I cannot guarantee how a judge will receive it." Lydia nodded. "What's the weakest part of our case?" Warren glanced at her with what appeared to be professional respect. "The document itself," he said. "If the Farrells present it, and the judge takes it at face value, before I can make the duress argument, it creates an impression we then have to spend time reversing. How do we counter that impression?" "Character witnesses," Warren said, "people of standing in this county who can speak to the household, to Mia's welfare, to your character specifically." He looked at Lydia. "The Farrells' lawyer will try to make you look like a woman of poor judgment and questionable history. We need people to say otherwise." "Who will come?" Ethan asked. "Ruth Cale," Lydia said immediately. "Without question," Ethan agreed. "Grace Tanner." "Amos Reed," Ethan added. "He won't speak badly of anyone." "Clay Dutton," Lydia said. Ethan looked at her. "You know Clay Dutton?" "He came to the door 3 days after the assembly," she said. "Brought a side of pork and said nothing about it except that it was a hard winter for everyone." She said it without particular emotion, but he could see what it had meant to her. The particular gratitude you feel for decency when decency has been scarce. They compiled the list. 7 names, eventually. Not all of them were certain, but most were. What was not on the list, and what both of them were aware of, was Harold Marsh. What Harold choosing to stop his campaign meant for the court situation was unclear. Whether he would, if asked, say something useful in the context of the petition, that was a different question, and not one Ethan was ready to ask yet. He went to see Harold 2 days before the court date. Harold's wife answered the door, and her face did the thing faces do when they're surprised and trying not to show it. A quick reset, an adjustment to neutral. She was a small, fair woman named Catherine, who had always been polite to Ethan without warmth, which he'd understood as loyalty to her husband's opinions rather than her own. "He's in the study," she said. And then, unexpectedly, "I'm glad things worked out for you, Ethan. I want you to know She stopped. "I'll get Harold." Harold came to the study door looking like a man who had been expecting this visit and hadn't decided how to feel about it. Ethan did not sit down. He stood in the doorway and said it plainly. "I'm not asking you to say anything you don't believe," he said. "But there's a court date in 2 days, and there's a man with money trying to take an infant from her mother. And if there's anything you'd be willing to say about the stability of what you've observed, even the parts that troubled you, I'd be grateful to hear it." Harold was quiet for a long moment. He looked at the window. He turned his pen over on the desk the way men do when they're thinking through something that doesn't have a clean answer. "The Farrell family," he said finally. "I know the name. I know what kind of family it is." "Yes." "And the petition." He looked at Ethan. "It's a custody claim." "Yes." Harold was quiet again. "She's a good mother," Harold said at last, and it cost him something visible to say it. I had concerns about the arrangement. I still have concerns about how it was handled. But watching her with the child, the few times I saw them in town..." He stopped, pressed his lips together. "She doesn't let that baby out of her sight, and the baby's healthy. Anyone can see that." Ethan waited. "I'll come," Harold said. "I'm not going to lie to any court, but if they ask me whether that child is being cared for properly, I'll tell them the truth of what I've seen." It was not an apology. It was not a conversion. It was Harold Marsh doing the right thing in the way Harold Marsh was capable of doing it, reluctantly, partially, and with the residual stiffness of a man who still hadn't entirely let go of his original position. It was enough. "Thank you," Ethan said. "Don't thank me," Harold said. "Just be what you told the assembly you were going to be." The court convened in Abilene, which was a full day's ride. Ethan, Lydia, and Mia made the journey the day before and stayed at the hotel on Front Street, which was clean and unremarkable, and served a breakfast of eggs and salt pork that Lydia ate without tasting and Ethan ate without appetite. Mia ate with enthusiasm, which suggested that at least one of them had gotten a good night's sleep. The courtroom was larger than the Calverton meeting hall and had the formal cold of rooms designed to remind you of the weight of what happens in them. The Farrell lawyer was already there when they arrived. A compact man named Gideon Hale, who wore a suit that cost more than most people in that county earned in a month, and who greeted Warren Ellis with the professional courtesy of a man who has no personal feelings about the matter and intends to prevail anyway. Douglas Farrell himself was not present. He had sent a representative, a cousin apparently named Marcus, who sat behind Hale and had the look of a man fulfilling an obligation he found distasteful. Ethan looked at him once and then stopped looking at him because Marcus was not the point. The point was the judge. Judge Beaumont was 60, heavy-set, with a face that had heard a great many things and given away very few of its reactions to them. He read the petition, read Warren's response, and then looked at both sides over his glasses with the expression of a man who has seen this particular shape of situation before and has formed no advance opinion about it. The hearing proceeded through the morning. Hale presented the petition, he presented the document Lydia had signed, and Warren objected on grounds of duress, and the judge heard arguments from both sides and said he would consider it. Hale presented witness statements, written ones, from people in the county east of Calverton who knew the Farrells and who had been coached to characterize Lydia in terms that were technically factual and impressionistically damaging. He used the phrase "woman of uncertain character" 3 times in 40 minutes, which Ethan counted. Lydia sat beside Warren with her hands folded in her lap and her face composed into absolute stillness. She did not react to the language used about her, not once. Ethan sat behind her and watched her back and thought about the mare in the barn and about what it costs a person to hold themselves that's still under that particular kind of fire. Warren presented their response with the methodical precision that was his best quality. He walked the judge through the marriage, the property record, the household documentation. He called Ruth Cale, who testified with the directness of a woman who has nothing to perform and everything to say. He called Grace Tanner, who was composed and specific, and said that she had watched Lydia Walker, she corrected herself, with that child, and that child was loved and healthy and wanted, and that in her 40 years of living in this county, she had not seen a mother more attentive. He called Harold Marsh. Hale looked faintly surprised when Warren named him. Ethan saw it. A quick recalibration behind the attorney's professional calm. Harold was Harold on the stand. Stiff, formal, precise. He answered every question without elaboration and with the careful accuracy of a man who believes that words mean what they say and should mean nothing extra. When Warren asked him whether, in his observation of the Walker household, the child Mia appeared to be properly cared for, Harold said, "Yes, she does." When Warren asked whether he had any reason to believe the child was in conditions of neglect or moral deficiency, Harold paused for a moment, long enough that the silence had weight, and said, "No, I do not." Hale cross-examined him on the assembly, on his earlier concerns about the arrangement. Harold answered honestly that he had expressed those concerns and that his assessment had changed based on what he had subsequently observed. Hale pressed, "What specifically changed your assessment, Mr. Marsh?" Harold looked at him. "Time," he said, "and paying attention to the right things." Hale let him go. The judge called a recess and came back 40 minutes later with a look that had not changed from the morning's careful neutral. He denied the Farrell petition. He did not do it with flourish. He read his reasoning in the measured cadence of a man covering the legal ground without editorializing. The document presented had been signed under documented conditions of coercion without counsel present, and its legal standing was insufficient to override the established rights of a biological parent residing in a documented stable household. The petition's claim of moral deficiency was unsupported by the preponderance of witness testimony. The child's welfare, as assessed by the evidence before the court, was not in question. He closed the file. Gideon Hale gathered his papers with the contained efficiency of a man filing the outcome away and moving on. Marcus Farrell left quickly without speaking to anyone. Ethan watched them go and felt not triumph, but something quieter, the particular settling of a long-held breath. Warren shook Lydia's hand and then Ethan's. "That's a good day," he said, which was, for Warren Ellis, a celebration. Lydia stood up from her chair. She had held her stillness throughout, and she held it now, standing in the emptying courtroom, looking at the closed file on the judge's bench. Ethan stood beside her. He didn't say anything. He knew the shape of this moment for her, the need to let it be real before you react to it being real. She reached out without looking at him and found his hand and held it. He held hers back. She was shaking slightly, just slightly, the shaking of something that has been held rigidly against a force for a long time and is now, carefully, letting the rigidity go. "It's over?" she said. "For now," Warren said from behind them. The Farrells could theoretically appeal. Given the judge's reasoning, it would be a difficult path for them. He paused. "I don't think they will. Hale's good enough to know when a case has exhausted itself." Lydia nodded. She let go of Ethan's hand. She picked up Mia from the bench where she'd been placed during the proceedings, surrounded by Ruth Cale on one side and Grace Tanner on the other, and apparently content with the situation. Mia grabbed Lydia's collar immediately and pulled, which was her standard greeting. "All right," Lydia said to the baby, extracting her collar from Mia's fist. "I heard you. We're going." They went out into the Abilene afternoon, the whole group of them, Ethan, Lydia, Mia, Ruth, Grace, Warren, Harold, who had stayed through the verdict and now stood slightly apart from the others near the courthouse steps with his hat in his hands. Ethan walked over to him. Harold looked at him. "Good outcome," he said. "It was. Thank you for what you said in there." Harold turned his hat over once. "I meant it." "I know you did. That's why it mattered." Harold put his hat back on. Something in his face was working through something, and Ethan waited for it. "Clara would have done what you did," Harold said. "Brought them in out of the cold. She would have done it without thinking twice." It was the most unexpected thing Harold Marsh had ever said to him. Ethan took a moment before he answered. I know, he said. That's part of why I did it, I think. Harold nodded, once, and walked down the steps toward his horse. Ruth came to stand beside Ethan. She watched Harold go with the impartial assessment of a woman who reserves judgment until she's seen enough to be sure. He'll never be your friend, she said. No, but he'll be decent. That's enough, Ethan said. Yes, Ruth agreed. It usually is. They made the ride back toward home with the afternoon light going gold and long ahead of them. Lydia rode beside Ethan. Mia settled against her in the carrier Ruth had constructed from 2 shawls and what appeared to be an impressive amount of practical geometry. The baby slept, which she did now with the confident abandon of an infant who has learned that sleep leads to waking up, and waking up leads to food and interesting faces, and both of those things are reliable. They didn't talk much on the ride. They didn't need to. The day had been full in every direction, and the quiet of moving through the open country in the late light was exactly what both of them needed. The kind of quiet that restores things rather than the kind that erodes them. About an hour from home, Lydia said, I've been thinking. About what? She looked at the road ahead. Spring is coming, the south field, so you said it hasn't been worked in 2 years. He looked at her. Ruth said there's a market in Mill Haven for winter vegetables if you plant them at the right time, she said. Turnips, cabbage, storage crops. She knows the timing. He was quiet for a moment. You're planning the planting. I'm thinking about the planting, she said. There's a difference. There is, he agreed. For what it's worth, I think it's a good idea. She glanced at him sideways. You haven't heard the details yet. No, but I trust your details. She looked at him for a moment with an expression he was still learning the full vocabulary of. Not the careful, guarded look she'd worn in the first weeks. Something more open than that. Something that had arrived in stages and was not yet entirely finished arriving, and probably wouldn't be for a long time yet, because that was the nature of real things. They don't complete themselves on a schedule anyone can predict. The south field, she said, and maybe the kitchen garden expanded. Ruth says the soil on the east side is better than it looks. Ruth knows soil, Ethan said. She knows a lot of things, Lydia said. She does. Mia stirred and made a sound. Not a cry, just the murmur of a baby surfacing briefly from sleep and deciding the situation was still acceptable and going back under. Lydia reached up and touched the top of the baby's head with 2 fingers, the way she did whenever Mia made a sound, as automatic and precise as breathing. The ranch came into view ahead, the dark shape of the house against the evening sky, the barn, the fence lines, the shape of things that were his and were now also theirs, which was still a fact he was getting used to and thought he probably would be getting used to for a long time. He had not known, standing at the barn door on the worst night of the winter, that the choice he was making was as large as it turned out to be. He had known it was right. Sometimes that is the only thing you know in the moment, and the size of the thing reveals itself later. The horse turned into the yard and the house was dark and needed the lamps lit, and Ethan climbed down and tied off and helped Lydia down with Mia, and they went inside and he lit the lamps, and the house came up around them warm and real. Southfield, he said, hanging up his coat. Southfield, Lydia confirmed, hanging up hers. Mia woke up fully and announced this with the directness she brought to all important communications, and Lydia went to sort that out, and Ethan built the fire up and put the kettle on and stood for a moment in the warm kitchen, listening to the sounds of his house, all of its sounds now, all of them belonging, and felt something he had not felt in so long, he had almost forgotten it was a thing a person could feel. Not happiness, exactly. Something more durable than that. Something that doesn't require everything to be going right, only that the things that matter most are present and real and worth fighting for. He had fought for them. They had held. Tomorrow there would be more to do, and the south field to plan, and Ruth's pie to eat, and Warren's final invoice to settle, and all the ordinary machinery of a life lived forward. There was enough difficulty still ahead. Harold's decent but not friendly, the ranch's lean winter accounts, the 10,000 adjustments that 2 people make when they are learning the full weight and shape of each other. None of it erased what the day had been. He made the tea, and Lydia came back with Mia on her hip, and they sat at the kitchen table in the lamplight, and outside the first real warmth of what might become spring was still weeks away but was no longer impossible. The south field was harder than either of them expected. Ethan had said it hadn't been worked in 2 years, which turned out to be the optimistic version of the truth. The actual version was that the soil had compacted into something approaching the consistency of packed clay in the lower half, and the upper half had a drainage problem that nobody had addressed because nobody had been paying attention to it. And the fence line along the east edge had 3 posts that were rotted at the base and would need replacing before anything planted near them would be safe from the deer that came down from the ridge in April. Lydia assessed all of this on the first warm morning of March, walking the field in her work boots with her arms crossed and her face doing the expression Ethan had come to think of as her engineering face. The look of a person cataloging problems not with discouragement, but with the particular focused attention of someone who intends to solve them. Ruth said the soil was workable, she said. Ruth said the soil on the east side was better than it looks, Ethan said. She didn't say the rest of it was good. There's a difference. There is. Lydia walked to the lower edge of the field and crouched down and pressed 2 fingers into the earth and looked at what came up on them. We can fix the drainage, she said. It'll take a week. Probably 2. She looked at him. 1.5. He thought about it. 1.5, he agreed. That was how most of their practical disagreements went, not resolved by one person convincing the other so much as by both of them arriving at the number that was actually right, which was usually somewhere between their starting positions. He had not expected marriage to work that way. He had not expected a great many things about how it actually worked. They had been married 6 weeks. It was not long enough to have figured anything out completely. It was long enough to have discovered the specific textures of each other's difficulties, the ways they were stubborn, the ways they were tender, the things that required patience, and the things that required simply being left alone. He had learned that Lydia needed 20 minutes in the morning before she was ready to talk to anyone, including him, and that she did her hardest thinking while doing something with her hands, and that she was slower to anger than he would have expected, but that when she arrived there, it was the sustained cold kind that was harder to navigate than the hot immediate kind. She had learned that he went silent when he was worried rather than talking through it, which she'd identified as a problem on day 9 of the marriage and had told him about directly, which had itself been a lesson in how differently 2 people can be taught to handle the same emotion. They were learning each other the way you learn a place you've come to live, not all at once, not without getting lost sometimes, but with the steady accumulation of days that eventually becomes familiarity and then something beyond familiarity that doesn't have a clean name. Mia was 8 months old now and had strong opinions about everything. She had opinions about her food, which she expressed by either accepting it with enthusiasm or rejecting it with a firmness that suggested she found the offering personally offensive. She had opinions about her sleeping arrangements, which had evolved from the blanket crate to a proper crib that Ethan had built over 3 evenings in the barn from good pine and which Mia had inspected upon introduction with the gravity of a building assessor. She had opinions about people. Some faces she responded to with immediate warmth. Others she regarded with a skepticism that made adults feel they had somehow failed a test. She had decided about Ethan sometime in February, and the deciding had been gradual and then sudden, the way things are when a small person concludes that someone is safe. She reached for him now when Lydia handed her a cross. She tracked him when he moved through the room. She had, in the last 2 weeks, begun attempting to pull herself to standing using whatever was available. The side of the crib, the kitchen table leg, Ethan's pant leg. And when she accomplished it, she looked around with an expression of such complete self-satisfaction that it was difficult not to laugh, which Ethan did, and which Mia took as the appropriate response to her achievement. He had not expected to love her. That was the honest truth of it. He had expected to care for her, to be responsible toward her, to protect her because she needed protecting. He had not expected the particular way she had installed herself in the center of his chest, like something that had always been supposed to be there and had only just arrived. He didn't talk about it. He was not a man who talked about things like that. But Lydia knew. She saw it in the way he moved around the baby, careful and unconscious at once, the way you are around something that matters without having decided to make it matter. One evening in mid-March, she said, watching him settle Mia into the crib after a prolonged bedtime negotiation that had taxed both of them, "You're good at this." He straightened up. "She wore me down." "I mean it." Lydia was leaning in the doorway. "You're good with her." He looked at the baby, who had finally surrendered to sleep with the absoluteness that only exhausted infants achieve. "I had a son," he said, "a long time ago." I remembered some of it. He hadn't talked about Thomas directly with Lydia before, not with the name attached. He'd mentioned him in the abstract, the loss, the shape of the absence, but not the person. He felt Lydia register this without looking at her. "How old was he?" she asked. Her voice was careful, not treading carefully, just being honest about the care required. "4," Ethan said. "Almost 5." The room was quiet. Mia's breathing was the deep, even breathing of a sleeping baby, which is one of the more peaceful sounds in the world. "I'm sorry," Lydia said. Not the reflexive version of it, the version that costs something. "It was a long time ago," he said. Then, "It wasn't long enough ago. It's never long enough ago for something like that." "No," she said. "It isn't." He came to the doorway and she moved to let him through. And they went back to the kitchen, and neither of them said anything more about Thomas that night. But something had shifted, and they both knew it. One of those moments where something that has been kept carefully behind glass is allowed out into the air, and the world does not end, and the keeping of it behind glass is revealed to have been the lonelier choice. April came, and with it the real thaw, the kind that meant business. Water running in the drainage ditches, mud in the yard that was genuine nuisance mud rather than the frozen hard kind. The horses restless with the return of warmth, the days lengthening with the particular insistence of spring on the northern frontier. The Southfield work had taken, as Ethan had predicted, closer to 2 weeks. The drainage fix, the post replacements, the soil breaking. Lydia had worked it beside him every day, and Ruth had come twice with her own opinion on the soil amendment, and between the three of them they had turned something neglected into something that had a chance. The planting happened the second week of April. Turnips, cabbage, 2 kinds of storage onion, and a row of carrots along the south edge that Lydia added, without consulting the original plan, and defended on the grounds that carrots were practical and Mia would be eating solid food properly by fall. Ethan did not argue with the carrots. It was while they were finishing the last of the planting that Warren Ellis's letter arrived, brought out by Amos Reed, who was heading that direction anyway, and who handed it to Ethan in the yard with a shrug that meant he didn't know what was in it. Ethan read it standing in the yard with dirt on his hands. The Farrell family had withdrawn. Not just the petition, all potential claim. Warren's letter was careful in its language, as Warren's letters always were, but the meaning was plain. Gideon Hale had advised his client that further legal action would be expensive, time-consuming, and unlikely to achieve a different result than the Abilene court had already rendered. Douglas Farrell had, apparently, accepted this advice. Warren had received a formal notice of withdrawal and would file the appropriate response. It was over. Ethan read the letter twice and then stood in the yard for a moment with the sun on his face and the smell of turned earth around him and the sound of Lydia talking to Mia. Somewhere behind the barn in the running commentary she kept up when she was working, and the baby was in the carrier on her back. He folded the letter. He went around the barn. Lydia was crouched near the fence line, checking the base of a post she'd been concerned about. Mia was on her back in the carrier, awake, examining the world over Lydia's shoulder with the alert intensity she brought to everything. When Ethan came around the corner, Mia spotted him and did the thing she'd started doing, a full-body expression of recognition and pleasure that involved both arms and a sound that wasn't quite a word yet, but was clearly trying to be. Lydia looked up. He held out the letter. She took it. She read it in the crouch, one hand steadying herself against the fence post. He watched her face while she read it, the careful neutral she maintained while processing, and then the thing that came after the neutral when it was real. Not explosion, not tears. A long, slow exhale that seemed to release something she'd been holding in her chest since February. She stood up. She read it again. "It's done," she said. "It's done." She handed the letter back. She looked at the fence post and then at the field, and then at nothing in particular, which was where people look when they're recalibrating around a fact that changes things. "He's not going to come back," she said. "No, Warren's confident. Warren is careful with confidence. He is, which is why it means something when he has it." Mia made a sound, impatient, directional, aimed at Ethan. Lydia unclipped the carrier with the efficiency of long practice and handed the baby across, and Mia grabbed Ethan's collar immediately with both fists and looked at him with satisfaction, as if she had accomplished exactly what she intended. "All right," Ethan told her. "Good morning to you too." Lydia watched the two of them. She had a look on her face that she was not trying to moderate or manage. Open, tired, something close to overwhelmed in the specific way that relief produces when there's been a very long time of not being relieved. "I don't know how to—" She stopped. "You don't need to," he said. "I do, actually." She looked at him directly. "I came to your barn with nothing. I had no right to expect anything from you. And you—" She stopped again, and he could see her working to find words that fit the thing she was trying to say, which was harder than it sounded because the thing was large and the words available for it are never quite adequate. "You didn't just take us in. You stood in front of everything that came at us, and you didn't move." "You didn't move either," he said. "I was terrified." "So was I." She looked at him. "The whole time," he said. "I don't know if that was obvious. I was afraid of getting it wrong, of not being— I hadn't been anyone's anything in 10 years. I didn't know if I still knew how." He looked at Mia, who was examining the button on his collar with deep concentration. "Turns out you don't forget entirely. You just get rusty." Lydia made a sound that was partway between a laugh and something else. "Rusty," she said. "Somewhat." She looked at the field they'd planted, at the neat rows still visible in the dark turned earth, at the fence posts standing straight, the drainage line running correctly, the whole arrangement of work done and ground prepared and the season ahead of them. "We should write to Warren," she said. "I'll go in tomorrow. And Ruth needs to know. She'll want to hear it in person." "We'll ride out Saturday," Lydia nodded. She took Mia back from him and settled the baby on her hip, and they walked back toward the house together through the spring mud, and the day continued around them with the ordinary fullness of days that have good news in them. That evening, after Mia was asleep, Ethan sat at the table and wrote 2 letters. One to Warren Ellis, brief and formal, acknowledging the receipt of the news and asking Warren to proceed with the necessary filings. One to no one, a letter he started and started again, that was really less a letter than the attempt to put in words something he had been carrying around and not articulated. He didn't finish it. He folded what he'd written and put it in the back of the ledger book and left it there. Some things don't need to be letters. Some things just need to be written down once so you know they're real. Lydia came downstairs for water and found him at the table. "You should sleep," she said. "In a bit." She got her water. She stood at the counter and looked at him in the lamplight with the expression she had that was different from all her other expressions, the one she didn't moderate, the one that arrived when she'd stopped deciding what to show and was just herself, unedited, standing in a kitchen. "Are you happy?" she asked. It was a simple question. It was also not a simple question at all. He thought about it the way he thought about things that deserved honest answers. "I'm not unhappy," he said. "That's different from before. Before I was just running the days. Now they feel like mine." He looked at the lamp. "Is that happiness?" "I'm not sure I remember clearly enough to compare." "I think that might be it," she said. "I think maybe that's what it actually is, when it's real, not the bright version, the regular one." He looked at her. "The regular one," he repeated. "Where you get up in the morning and the day is yours," she said. "And the people in it are yours, and you're not just waiting for something to go wrong." He thought that was the most precise definition he had ever heard. "Then yes," he said. "I think so." She went back upstairs. He sat for a while longer and then banked the fire and went up himself. And the house was quiet in the way it was quiet now. Full rather than empty, still rather than hollow, the silence of rest rather than absence. Spring deepened through April and into May. The south field came up. Tentative at first, the first thin lines of green that required you to know what you were looking at before you could be sure they were what you hoped. And then with more confidence as the weeks moved, the rows filling in, the plants establishing themselves in the fixed particular way of things that have decided to live. Mia pulled herself to standing and took her first steps in the 3rd week of May, crossing 3 feet of kitchen floor from the table leg to Lydia's waiting hands, with an expression of furious concentration that gave way to complete amazement at what she had done. And Lydia caught her and laughed in the unguarded way she laughed now more often than before. And Ethan was there and saw it and understood that he would remember this moment for the rest of his life. Ruth came for supper the following Saturday, and Mia demonstrated her walking for her, and Ruth watched with her arms crossed and said, "She's going to be trouble," which was the highest form of compliment Ruth Cale paid to anyone. "She already is," Lydia said. "Good," Ruth said. "The world needs more of it." Grace Tanner came to the ranch for the first time in June, bringing preserves she'd put up and no particular reason given for the visit, which meant the reason was the visit itself. She sat at the kitchen table and held Mia and talked with Lydia about the kitchen garden and about the summer market in Millhaven and about nothing in particular with the ease of women who have found their way to genuine liking rather than performed cordiality. When she left, she pressed Lydia's hand and said, "You've made a good life here," and meant it in the way that simple, true statements mean something different from complicated ones. Lydia watched her wagon go down the road and said nothing for a moment. Then she said, "I didn't expect this." "The visit?" Ethan asked. "Any of it. The way people, some of them," she stopped. "I spent so long expecting the worst from everyone that I forgot you could be wrong about that." "You weren't wrong to expect it, based on what had happened." "No," she agreed. "I wasn't. But I was carrying it into places it didn't belong anymore." She looked at the road, empty now, the dust of Grace Tanner's wagon already settled. "That takes a while to put down." "Yes," he said. "It does." He knew something about that. He had put down his own version of it in stages. The conviction that loss was the permanent weather, that nothing warm was going to hold, that the right posture toward everything was moderate distance. He had not put it all down at once. He had put it down the way you carry something heavy a long way. Not in a moment of decision, but in increments, setting it down briefly and picking it back up, and eventually one day realizing you'd left it somewhere behind you and hadn't gone back. The feral business was not quite finished, in the sense that nothing that touches a person deeply is ever simply finished. There were days when Lydia went quiet in a particular way that he recognized as the gravity of that old fear pulling at her. When Mia was sick with a winter cold, when a legal-looking letter arrived that turned out to be nothing, when she woke at 3 in the morning from a dream she didn't describe. He did not try to argue her out of those moments. He had learned that the most useful thing was to be present in them without demanding they resolve on any schedule but their own. She did the same for him, on the days when the anniversary of Thomas's death moved through him like weather, or when he dreamed about Clara and woke to the dark bedroom disoriented, not knowing for a moment where the grief ended and the present began. She did not ask him to explain it or work through it. She handed him coffee and sat near him and let the morning come at its own pace, which was more than he deserved and exactly what he needed. That too was something he had not anticipated about marriage. Not the comfort of it. He had known people could comfort each other, but the specificity of it. The way the right person's presence doesn't erase pain but makes it less isolating. The way grief shared is not grief halved but grief accompanied, which is a different thing and in some ways better. Harold Marsh, true to Ruth's prediction, was decent. He was not warm. He did not come to supper or seek out conversation with Lydia or go out of his way to make amends for the assembly or the midnight visit or the months of quiet pressure. But he stopped the campaign, completely and without ongoing incidents, and when Ethan came into the dry goods store, he was treated with the ordinary courtesy due any man who spends money there. Once, in August, Harold tipped his hat to Lydia on Main Street, and Lydia nodded back, and that was the whole of it, small and sufficient, and the most that was going to happen between them. Ruth said, "That's Harold doing the best he can." Lydia said, "Then the best he can is enough." Which was, Ethan thought, as fair an assessment as any. Amos Reed brought his wife to the ranch in July under the pretense of asking about a fence repair and stayed for 3 hours and left having eaten 2 meals and having allowed their youngest daughter to follow Mia around the yard for the entire afternoon, which Mia accepted as her natural due. The Duttons came in August. Margaret from the post office left a jar of honey on the porch one morning without knocking, which was her way, and which Lydia received with the particular affection people feel for gestures that ask nothing back. Not everyone came around. The Aldis brothers still crossed the street on occasion. Agnes Brower at the boarding house remained in the complicated middle territory of her statement at the assembly. Not unkind, not easy. Some people in Calverton had fixed ideas about what had happened and were not going to revise them, and Ethan had made his peace with that. You cannot move an entire community in a single season. You can hold your ground and live your life honestly and let time do what time does, which is sometimes more than you expect and sometimes exactly nothing. What he had not expected, and this was the thing that surprised him most in the end, was how little it mattered. He did not mean that dismissively. The community's opinion had mattered enormously when it was weaponized against Lydia, when it was combined with the feral petition as a tool to threaten her daughter's safety. In that context, it had real weight and required a real fight. But once the fight was done, once Mia was secure and the legal ground was established, and the house was simply a house where people lived, the number of people in Calverton who approved of them versus the number who quietly didn't cease to be the axis around which anything important turned. His world had contracted and expanded simultaneously. Contracted to the people and things that were actually present in it. Lydia, Mia, Ruth, the handful of people who had chosen to be decent, the ranch, the South Field, the daily work of maintaining a life. Expanded because all of those things were enough. More than enough. The emptiness he had spent 10 years managing had been filled not with everything he'd hoped for, but with something specific and real and his. And specific and real and his turned out to be worth more than he'd remembered. He thought about that on a September evening, sitting on the porch in the last of the warm weather, with a cup of coffee going cold in his hand, watching the light go out of the sky over the western ridge. Lydia was inside putting Mia down, and he could hear the murmured ritual of that through the open window. The low voice, the baby's increasingly drowsy sounds, the particular sequence of settling that they had both learned like a language. He thought about the barn, the lantern light falling across frozen hay, a young woman looking up at him with fear and pride mixed in her face, arms wrapped around something she was not going to let go of regardless of what he did next. He had almost not gone out. That was the truth of it. He had been tired and the cold had been brutal and the sound could have been anything. He had sat for a moment in the chair by the window and almost decided to wait until morning. He thought about that version of the night sometimes. The one where he didn't go out. The one where Lydia and Mia were found in the barn in the morning, or not found. And the barn was empty and the house was empty, and he sat at a table with one plate in front of him, and the days ran the same in all directions as far as he could see. The smallest hinge sometimes. The smallest decision, go out or don't. Open the door or close it, say the word or leave it unsaid. He had gone out. Lydia came through the front door and sat in the other chair and pulled her shawl around her and looked out at the same view he'd been looking at. The darkening ridge, the last orange edge of light, the first stars appearing in the east. "She's down," Lydia said. "How long did it take?" "Longer than it should have. She's too interested in everything." A pause. "She said something today." He looked at her. "Not a real word, but almost." Lydia's face was doing the thing it did when something had happened with Mia that she hadn't finished feeling yet. She looked at me and she said, "It sounded like Ma, twice." He was quiet for a moment. "Did you?" he started. "I didn't react," Lydia said. "I didn't want to make a big thing of it and then have it not be what I thought." She looked at her hands. "But it sounded like what I thought it was." "It was," he said. "I'd bet on it." She looked out at the darkening sky. "She'll say it properly soon." "She will. And then you'll be—" She stopped, glanced at him. He understood what she was trying to work out how to say. The question of what Mia would call him, a question neither of them had addressed directly, because Mia was too young for it to be immediate, and because addressing it directly would require both of them to say something about what Ethan was in this child's life. And that was a territory they had been approaching gradually from the edges rather than walking into from the front. "Whatever she calls me is what I am," he said. "She gets to decide." Lydia looked at him. "That's not—" "What?" "A lot of men wouldn't say it that way." "I'm not a lot of men." "No," she said. "You're not." A silence. "If she calls you what I think she's going to call you," Lydia said carefully, "I want you to know that it's right. What she means by it will be right." He held that for a moment. The weight of what she was giving him permission to be. The specificity of it. "I know," he said. She nodded. They sat with that. The dark came on fully and the stars multiplied and the temperature dropped the way it dropped on September evenings. fast enough to remind you that the warm was borrowed and would need giving back, but not yet, not tonight. Inside, a small voice made a sound, not a cry, an opinion. Mia's opinions had diversified considerably since February, and she delivered them at all hours. "She's not actually awake," Lydia said, not moving. "No," Ethan agreed. The sound settled, quiet again. He thought about what to say, or whether to say anything. He had gotten better at knowing which moments required words and which ones only required presence. This one, he thought, was on the edge. "I want to ask you something," he said. "Ask." "The first night, in the barn." He looked at his coffee cup. "What did you think when I came in? Honestly." She was quiet for a moment. He could tell she was actually remembering rather than constructing an answer. "I thought you were going to throw us out," she said. "I thought, in the best version, you'd throw us out rather than something worse. I was trying to figure out if I could get past you and back to the road." She paused. "I was so cold I couldn't actually think clearly, but I was still planning. Even then. Always. It's what I do." She pulled the shawl tighter. "And then you crouched down. You got low so you weren't above me. And you said—" She stopped. "I know what I said." "It was the most ordinary thing," she said. "You said you weren't going to hurt us. And then you said I have a fire and food. And I thought, people say things. People say things and then do different things. But you looked—" She turned to look at him. "You looked tired. Not threatening. Just tired. And like you hadn't expected to be out in the cold any more than I'd expected to be in your barn. It was too ordinary to be a performance." "It wasn't," he said. I know that now." She looked back at the stars. "I didn't know it then. But I had nowhere else to go, and Mia was—" She stopped, cleared her throat once, quietly. She was so cold. He nodded. They had come so close to the version where he didn't go out. He had not told Lydia about the moment of hesitation. He didn't think he ever would. "Some things you carry yourself." "I'm glad you didn't go to the road," he said. "So am I," she said. "Most days." He looked at her. "I'm joking," she said. "I know." She wasn't entirely joking, and they both knew that too. That was the thing about what was real between them. It contained the hard parts as well as the good ones. And the hard parts were not hidden or smoothed over. They were simply also present alongside everything else. The grief she still carried for the years before. The wariness that didn't entirely leave. The parts of him that were still being reconstituted from the man grief had made him into. They were not a story about two perfect people finding each other. They were a story about two broken-in people choosing each other anyway, with full information, on purpose. That was better. Harder and better. In October, Warren Ellis sent a final letter confirming the closure of all feral proceedings. He had received written confirmation from Gideon Hale's firm that the family would pursue no further action. The letter was brief and professional, and at the bottom Warren had written, in his small, careful hand, "Well done, Ethan, to both of you." Lydia read it and folded it and put it in the box she kept in the top drawer of the dresser, the box that also contained the marriage certificate and Mia's record of birth and a few other documents she considered worth preserving. She put the letter in and closed the box and put it back in the drawer and said nothing. But that night, after Mia was asleep, she came to where Ethan was working on the harness at the kitchen table, and she put her hand on his shoulder briefly, just briefly, and went to get herself water. He understood. He went back to the harness. November brought the first hard frost, and with it the harvest of what they'd planted in April. The turnips came up solid, the cabbage was good, the storage onions were better than expected, and the carrots that had not been in the original plan were a success that Lydia noted with an even-handedness that did not quite disguise her satisfaction. "The carrots," Ethan said one evening when they were putting up the last of the harvest. "What about them?" "You were right about the carrots." She looked at him. "I'm frequently right." "You are," he agreed. "I'm getting better at noticing sooner." She handed him a jar to seal and said nothing, but the side of her mouth moved in a way that meant she was filing that away for later. Ruth came for the harvest supper and brought 2 pies and her opinion on next year's planting, which was detailed and definitive and incorporated everything she had observed about the Southfield soil behavior over the growing season. They sat at the table until late, the 4 of them, Ethan, Lydia, Ruth, and Mia, who had been allowed to stay up past her bedtime and was making the most of it. and talked about the land and the plans and the winter coming and the spring after that. Mia fell asleep in Ruth's lap mid-conversation, which Ruth bore with equanimity. She trusts you, Lydia said. Smart child, Ruth said. Finally. It was meant as a joke about Mia's initial wariness toward her. It landed with more meaning than that, because smart child and finally covered a lot of territory, and Ruth knew it, and her eyes when she looked at Lydia over the sleeping baby were not the eyes of a woman being funny. Thank you, Lydia said, for the beginning, for coming to the door that first time. You'd have found your feet, Ruth said. Maybe, but faster because of you. Ruth accepted this without deflection, which was the right response. That's what people are for, she said, when they're doing it right. Ethan thought about that for a long time after Ruth had gone, after Mia was in her crib and the lamps were low. That's what people are for, when they're doing it right. He had spent 10 years with a much narrower definition of what people were for. He had narrowed it down to his own survival and the running of his land and the keeping of things maintained. He had lost the broader definition along with everything else. He had found it again. That was what had happened, really, stripped of all the legal complexity and the town politics and the drama of the feral petition. He had found it again, and it had cost him something, and it had given him back something larger than what the cost had been. He did not think he had been a particularly brave man through any of it. He thought he had mostly been a man who was tired of the alternative and had made a series of decisions that followed logically from that tiredness. Standing in front of Harold Marsh's assembly, writing the check to Warren Ellis, asking Lydia to marry him on a low stool in the lamplight, none of those had felt like courage in the moment. They had felt like the only available option that he could live with afterward. Maybe that was what courage actually was. Not the absence of fear or cost, but the refusal to let fear or cost be the deciding factor. The decision that what you stand to keep matters more than what you stand to lose. He had lost enough to know the difference. There was one more thing. In December, on a Sunday afternoon when the first real snow of the season was coming down outside, and Mia was napping and the house was warm and Lydia was reading in the chair by the window, Ethan went upstairs and came back down with a small box he had taken from the shelf in the wardrobe where it had sat untouched for 10 years. He set it on the table. Lydia looked up from her book. I want to show you something, he said. He opened the box. Inside was a photograph, formal studio work, the kind that required sitting still for longer than most people managed easily, which showed in the slight blur at the edges. A woman and a young child. The woman had dark hair and an expression that was trying to be serious for the camera and not quite succeeding. Clara, Lydia said. Yes. And Thomas. He looked at the photograph. I put this away a long time ago because I couldn't look at it. I thought, eventually it would be easier. He was quiet. It didn't get easier. I just got used to not looking. Lydia set her book down. She looked at the photograph carefully and with real attention, the way she looked at things that deserved it. He has your jaw, she said. That's what she always said. A small silence. She sounds like she was someone worth knowing, Lydia said. She was. He looked at the photograph. I think she would have liked you. She had no patience for pretense. She always liked people who meant what they said. Lydia nodded. She did not say anything tidy or consoling. She sat with the information and let it be what it was. He put the photograph back in the box, but he did not take it back upstairs. He set the box on the shelf by the window, the shelf where Lydia kept her book and a small clay jar that Mia had chosen at the general store and that served no purpose except that Mia had wanted it. He set it there where it could be seen. Lydia watched him do this without comment. They sat for a while in the quiet of the snowing afternoon, each with their own thoughts, the house holding all of it, the living and the lost, the before and the now, the full complicated weight of two people who had arrived at something real by a harder route than most. Outside, the snow covered the south field and the fence post and the road and the barn and the yard. The same way it had covered everything the night Ethan had heard a sound and gone to check it. The same cold, the same dark, the same question of what you do when someone needs something and you're the person standing there. He had gone out. He had opened the barn door, and in the end, that was the whole of it. Not bravery or heroism or the grand gesture, just a man, cold and tired, who heard something and decided it was worth his attention. who kept deciding that every day after, through everything that deciding cost him. The fire burned in the stove. Mia slept upstairs with the absolute commitment of a child who is healthy and warm and loved. The snow fell with the sound snow makes, which is no sound at all. Lydia turned a page. Ethan picked up his ledger. The house was full.